It began with a silence that did not feel natural. A silence that stretched across the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes like a warning whispered by the winter itself. The air hung heavy over Malmedy, a small Belgian town that had seen war before, but never like this. Frost clung to the branches of pine trees until they cracked under their own weight. Roads shimmered with ice under a pale sun that barely warmed the sky. And beneath that silence, beneath the stillness that made every breath visible, something dangerous gathered, something waiting, listening, preparing. In the early days of December 1944, Malmedy looked too peaceful to be real. Villagers moved cautiously through the cold, carrying water, stacking wood, patching shattered windows from the bombings weeks before. American soldiers rotated through the area, tired but hopeful, believing that winter might give them a brief pause in the fighting. Fires flickered in basements and barns where troops rested, warming their gloved hands, wiping their rifles dry, trying to shake the chill that settled into bone. But the Ardennes has never been kind to those who mistake quiet for safety. Long before the first shot, the forest sensed something approaching. The birds were gone. The wind died. The nights grew sharper, biting at exposed skin. And on the far side of the tree line, deep in the shadows, where branches tangled like skeletal fingers, German armoured columns prepared to strike with a speed and violence the Americans could not imagine. They were not moving like retreating men. They were moving like men who believed they could reverse the direction of the entire war in a single blow. When the German offensive erupted on December morning, it did not announce itself politely. It tore across the Ardennes like 1,000 storms breaking at once. Artillery screamed through the forest. Snow exploded into the air. Tanks growled forward, their engines echoing across frozen valleys. American units were swept into confusion, lines collapsing, radios crackling, reports arriving too late to matter. And into that chaos moved Kampfgruppe Peiper, and the roads around Malmedy became the site of one of the war's most infamous moments. The men at the Baugnez Crossroads that morning had no reason to expect disaster. They were part of a scattered column, lightly armed, barely awake, guiding vehicles through icy turns and narrow paths carved between walls of snow. Some joked about the cold, some smoked, some leaned against trucks to relieve aching legs. Winter had slowed everything, or so they believed. But winter wasn't slowing the enemy, it was hiding them. When the first German vehicles appeared on the road, the Americans were shocked not by the presence of tanks, but by how quickly the situation spiraled out of their control. The crossroads became a trap. Engines stalled, trucks skidded, weapons froze. Soldiers were forced into surrender not by cowardice, but by the crushing weight of overwhelming force. What happened next would echo through history. The Malmedy Massacre was not a battle. It was an atrocity, a moment where war stripped away the last thin layers of humanity and revealed something colder than the winter that surrounded them. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, their forms half covered by frost. Some tried to run, some tried to hide, some prayed, some simply stood still, believing obedience might save them. It didn't. What survived that day was not just horror but fury, a fury that spread through American ranks like fire through dry grass. The massacre reshaped the emotional landscape of the Ardennes. It hardened resolve, it sharpened anger, it turned Malmedy into a symbol not just of loss, but of what the Americans vowed to never let happen again. But the story of Malmedy is larger than a single crime. It is the story of a town caught in the center of an unfolding catastrophe. It is the story of a ridge, a crossroads, a river, and a forest that all became unwilling witnesses. It is the story of men who held the line when the world seemed to break around them. It is the story of the brutal, frozen, unforgiving Ardennes, and the battle that raged across it long after the massacre's last echo faded. Tonight, we return to Malmedy, to the snow that fell like ash, to the roads slick with ice and fear, to the hollow sound of boots crunching through the quiet after gunfire, to the faces of soldiers who carried the weight of what they saw deeper into the winter, deeper into the Bulge, deeper into the heart of a war that demanded more of them than any human should ever be asked to give. Before we continue, I want to ask you something soft, something personal, in your own words. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what hour has reached you there? Is it late? Is it calm? Is it a moment where the room around you feels still? And if these long, steady journeys through the past help you rest, settle your mind, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. December 17th, 1944, 12:30 in the afternoon. 30 American trucks roll through the snow-covered hills of eastern Belgium, their engines grinding against the cold. The men of Battery B huddle in canvas-covered beds, breath visible in the freezing air, sharing cigarettes and complaints about the weather. They are artillerymen, not infantry observation specialists, whose job is to spot enemy positions and call in coordinates. Most have never fired a rifle in combat. None of them know that in less than an hour, they will become victims of one of the Second World War's most infamous atrocities. The convoy commander, Captain Roger Mills, checks his map at a place the Belgians call Baugnez, a simple crossroads, where two rural highways meet, roughly 2.5 kilometers south of the town of Malmedy. His orders are straightforward. Relocate the battery's observation equipment to support the 7th Armoured Division near St. Vith, where German forces have been probing American positions. Intelligence reports suggest light enemy activity in the area. The Ardennes forest has been quiet for weeks. Considered a rest sector where green divisions train and exhausted units recover, Captain Mills has no reason to believe this will be anything but a routine movement. He signals the convoy forward through the intersection. Behind him, 140 men in 30 vehicles follow into history. What Captain Mills cannot know, what American intelligence has catastrophically failed to detect, is that the largest German offensive since 1940 has smashed through Allied lines just 24 hours earlier. Operation Wachs am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, has unleashed 410,000 German troops along an 85-mile front in a desperate gamble to split the British and American armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. At the spearhead of this offensive, driving deeper into American territory than any other German unit, is Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of 4,800 Waffen-SS soldiers commanded by 29-year-old SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. His column of 600 vehicles and over 100 tanks has already penetrated 12 miles behind what were, just yesterday, secure American positions, and at this precise moment, Peiper's lead elements are approaching the same crossroads from the south. The temperature hovers around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Light snow falls intermittently, limiting visibility to roughly 200 yards. The soldiers in Battery B's trucks talk about Christmas packages from home, about the rumour that they might get leave to Paris, about a card game planned for tonight. Private Homer Ford, 23 years old, from Pennsylvania, tries to stay warm by stomping his feet against the truck bed's metal floor. Corporal Virgil Larry, from Tennessee, shares a chocolate bar with the man next to him. These are ordinary moments, the mundane texture of military life. In 90 minutes, Ford will be lying in a frozen field, pretending to be dead, while German soldiers walk among the bodies, shooting survivors. Larry will spend 3 hours motionless in the snow, a corpse pressed against his face, waiting for the SS troops to leave. Neither man will ever fully escape this crossroads. The convoy's pace slows as vehicles navigate the icy intersection. Some soldiers glance at the open fields, on either side, pasture land now covered in December snow, a few scattered farmhouses in the distance. It's exposed terrain, tactically vulnerable, but the men aren't thinking tactically. They're thinking about cold feet and hot coffee and whether the new position will have better billets than the last one. Then, from the south, comes a sound that makes the veterans sit up straight, the distinctive rumble of tank engines, heavy engines, German engines. The first Panther tank appears through the snow like a grey ghost, its long 75mm gun traversing toward the American trucks. Behind it, more tanks, half-tracks, armoured cars. The lead vehicles of Kampfgruppe Peiper have arrived at the crossroads at almost the same moment as Battery B. What happens in the next 3 minutes is chaos. American soldiers jump from trucks, scrambling for weapons they mostly don't have. Artillerymen carry carbines and pistols, not the rifles and machine guns of infantry. A few vehicles try to reverse, colliding with trucks behind them. Captain Mills attempts to organise a defence, shouting orders that are drowned out by the roar of tank engines and the crack of German machine gun fire. It's immediately obvious that resistance is suicide. The Americans have perhaps 30 light weapons against tanks, armoured vehicles, and at least 200 SS troops. White flags appear, undershirts, handkerchiefs, anything white. The shooting stops. Men raise their hands above their heads. The surrender is complete by 12:57, less than 5 minutes after first contact. German soldiers, identifiable by their distinctive SS camouflage smocks and the twin lightning bolt insignia of the Waffen-SS, begin gathering the Americans. Hands remain raised. The soldiers are ordered out of their vehicles and herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the Crossroads. Approximately 130 to 150 men stand in a rough cluster, breath steaming in the cold air, watching their captors with a mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because these are SS troops whose reputation for brutality precedes them. Relief, because they've survived the initial contact. Because being a prisoner means the war is over for them. Because the Geneva Convention protects captured soldiers. The Germans begin searching prisoners, confiscating watches, rings, cigarettes, personal items. This is technically illegal, but hardly unusual. Some of the Americans exchange nervous glances. The situation feels wrong, but war often feels wrong. They wait to see what happens next. 2 German armoured cars position themselves at the edge of the field. Their commanders swivel the vehicle's machine guns toward the cluster of American prisoners. Several SS soldiers move to flanking positions. The Americans, many of them young men barely out of their teens, don't yet understand what they're witnessing. This looks like preparation for something, but preparation for what? A march to a prison camp? Transport to a holding area? The veterans among them have heard stories about German brutality, especially from the SS, but mass execution of over 100 American prisoners seems inconceivable. This is the Western Front, not the Eastern Front, where such atrocities are rumoured to be common. These are Americans, not Russians or Poles. Surely the rules still apply here. Surely even the SS wouldn't commit such an act. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, an SS officer draws his pistol. What happens next will take 12 minutes. 12 minutes to transform American soldiers into corpses. 12 minutes that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and create one of the Second World War's most documented war crimes. The officer raises his weapon, aims at the nearest American prisoner, and fires. For a frozen moment, nothing happens. The shock is so complete that even sound seems suspended. Then the German machine guns open fire. The standing prisoners fall like wheat before a scythe. Some run. All are shot down. The screaming begins. And in that snow-covered Belgian field, as men die begging for mercy that will not come, the Malmedy massacre passes from future tense to present, from possibility to terrible, unchangeable fact. The crossroads at Baugnez will never be just a crossroads again. It will become a place name synonymous with atrocity, a symbol of SS brutality, a rallying cry for American soldiers who will chalk Avenge Malmedy on their tanks and artillery shells. But that's later. Right now, in the last seconds before the shooting starts, it's just a place where men are about to die. Just an intersection where routine military movement intersected with systematic military evil. Just 12 minutes that will echo through decades. The soldiers don't know yet that some of them will survive. They don't know yet that their testimony will bring war criminals to trial. They don't know anything except that the Germans are raising their weapons and there's nowhere to run. December 17th, 1944, 1:15 in the afternoon. The Battle of Malmedy, which was never a battle at all, begins. November 10th, 1944, the Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler unfolds a large map across the conference table in his fortified headquarters, his hands trembling slightly from the Parkinson's disease that has begun to ravage his body. Before him stand some of Germany's most senior military commanders, summoned here under conditions of absolute secrecy. What Hitler is about to reveal will shock them into silence. He places his finger on the map, tracing a line through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, all the way to the Belgian coast. Here, he says, we will split the Anglo-American alliance. Here, we will change the course of the war. The generals exchange glances. What he's proposing is impossible. Germany no longer has the resources for a major offensive. But Hitler is not asking for opinions. He's issuing orders. The strategic situation facing Germany in late 1944 is catastrophic by any objective measure. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army has driven German forces back across Poland and is approaching the borders of the Reich itself. In the West, American and British forces have liberated France and are pushing toward the German frontier. Germany's cities are being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock Allied bombing. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, has been reduced to a shadow force, unable to contest Allied air supremacy. German industrial production, despite Albert Speer's organizational genius, cannot match the combined output of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. Every rational military calculation suggests that Germany should seek terms, negotiate some kind of armistice. accept defeat before the Reich is completely destroyed. But Adolf Hitler does not deal in rational calculations anymore. His plan, which he has codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein after a patriotic German song, is audacious to the point of delusion. Germany will scrape together every available unit, strip the Eastern Front to dangerous levels, call up the last reserves, and hurl this force through the weakest point in the Allied line, the heavily forested, lightly defended Ardennes region, where the American, British, and French lines meet. The objective is the port city of Antwerp, Belgium's major harbour through which the Allies funnel the vast majority of their supplies. If Antwerp falls, the Allied supply line collapses. More importantly, Hitler believes the capture of Antwerp will physically separate the British armies in the north from the American armies in the south, creating a political crisis that will shatter the Western alliance. Churchill and Roosevelt will be forced to negotiate. Germany will then transfer all forces east to deal with the Soviets. It's a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that Hitler has convinced himself can work. The forces assembled for this operation represent an astonishing feat of logistics and a damning indictment of German strategic priorities. Over 410,000 men, 29 divisions are concentrated in the narrow Eifel region of Western Germany, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, including the dreaded Tiger and Panther models that can destroy any Allied tank in single combat, 2,600 artillery pieces. The Germans achieve complete tactical surprise by maintaining radio silence, moving troops only at night, and spreading disinformation about defensive preparations. American intelligence, grown complacent after months of steady advance, interprets the German build-up as nothing more than defensive positioning. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, considers the Ardennes so unlikely as an attack route that he's positioned his greenest divisions there, treating it as a quiet sector where inexperienced units can acclimate to combat. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The barrage is the largest concentration of German firepower since the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. American positions, many of them manned by divisions that have never seen serious combat, are obliterated. Within minutes, German infantry and armour pour through the shattered American lines. The Ardennes offensive, which the Americans will later call the Battle of the Bulge, has begun. In the first 24 hours, entire American units simply cease to exist, overrun so quickly they cannot even report their destruction. 2 regiments of the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division surrender en masse over 8,000 men, the largest American capitulation in the European theatre. The Germans are inside the American defensive zone, exploiting the gap, racing west. Leading one of the most crucial thrusts is Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group built around the 1st SS Panzer Regiment and personally commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. He has been assigned Rollbahn D, Route D, the northernmost of the offensive's main advance routes. His mission is brutally simple: punch through the American lines, ignore resistance, bypass strong points, and drive straight for the Meuse River bridges. Speed is everything. Peiper is explicitly told to avoid being bogged down in combat, to keep moving regardless of what he encounters. His 4,800-man force includes some of the most experienced SS troops in the German military, veterans of the Russian front where they learned that hesitation means death, and mercy is a luxury armies cannot afford. These are not the conscripts and old men who increasingly fill German ranks. These are ideological warriors, believers in National Socialism, men who have internalized the Nazi doctrine that enemy lives, particularly Slavic or Jewish lives, but increasingly all enemy lives have no value. The orders Peiper receives, and which he transmits to his subordinate commanders, are ambiguous in a way that provides plausible deniability while clearly communicating expectations. He is told to move with wave of terror and fright, and without humane inhibitions. He is told that his unit's speed and ruthlessness must spread fear and terror. He is explicitly told that prisoners will slow the advance, that time is more valuable than observing niceties. No one says kill all prisoners, but the meaning is understood. On the Eastern Front, where Peiper and his men have spent years fighting, prisoners are routinely shot. Entire villages suspected of harbouring partisans are burned with their inhabitants inside. The Geneva Convention is treated as a quaint Western European custom that doesn't apply when facing unto-mention subhumans, as Nazi ideology classifies Slavs, Jews, and increasingly anyone who opposes Germany. Peiper's men are bringing Eastern Front rules to the Western Front. Within the first day of the offensive, Peiper's Kampfgruppe achieves breakthrough. They overrun American positions at the German-Belgian border, capture the town of Honsfeld, and seize desperately needed fuel supplies from American depots. But they're already behind schedule. Hitler's plan requires reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. Peiper is moving fast, but not fast enough. Every hour of delay means Allied reinforcements getting closer, means American air power grounded by bad weather on December 16th, potentially clearing to strike his columns. The pressure is immense, and under this pressure, the atrocities begin. At Honsfeld, Peiper's troops shoot 19 American prisoners in the town square, executing them against a wall before Belgian civilian witnesses. At Billingen, 8 more Americans are murdered after surrendering. These are not isolated incidents committed by rogue soldiers. This is a pattern, a deliberate choice made repeatedly as the Kampfgruppe drives west. By the morning of December 17th, Peiper has penetrated 12 miles into American-held territory, the deepest German penetration of the entire offensive. He's outrun his supply lines, lost radio contact with his higher headquarters, and his tanks are consuming fuel faster than he can capture it. American resistance is stiffening as reinforcements arrive. The weather remains overcast, grounding Allied aircraft, but Peiper knows this luck cannot last. His entire advance is a calculated gamble. If he can reach the Meuse bridges before American forces destroy them, he can establish a bridgehead that might allow the rest of the German offensive to succeed. If he gets bogged down, if he's delayed by even a few hours, the entire operation collapses. It's in this state of desperate urgency, with orders emphasizing speed above all else, with a command climate that explicitly devalues enemy lives, that Kampfgruppe Peiper approaches the Crossroads at Baugnez. The stage is set, a desperate German offensive requiring impossible speed, an SS commander with a documented history of war crimes and explicit orders to avoid being slowed by prisoners. American forces caught completely by surprise, fragmentary units scattered across the Ardennes, trying to reorganize in chaos. And at one particular crossroads, 2 forces are about to collide. The strategic desperation of Hitler's last gamble is about to produce a tactical atrocity. The contempt for the rules of war that Germany's Eastern Front experience has normalized is about to manifest in Belgium. December 17th, 1944, early afternoon. Everything that has led to this moment, the failing German strategic position, Hitler's delusion that one bold stroke can reverse fortune, the ideology that makes enemy soldiers less than human, the pressure to move faster than possible converges at a place called Malmedy. What happens there will be a direct consequence of what was decided here in the Wolf's Lair 5 weeks earlier. January 30, 1915, Berlin, Germany. A son is born to Waldemar and Charlotte Peiper, a middle-class family navigating the privations of the First World War. They name him Joachim. He will grow up in defeated, humiliated Germany, in the chaos of the Weimar Republic, surrounded by veterans bitter about the Versailles Treaty and convinced that Germany lost the war not through military defeat but through betrayal at home. By the time Joachim Peiper is 18 years old, he will have joined the SS. By 30, he will be one of Nazi Germany's most decorated combat commanders. And by the time he is brought to trial for war crimes, investigators will struggle with a disturbing question. How does an educated, intelligent man from a respectable family become responsible for the deaths of hundreds of unarmed prisoners? Peiper's path into the SS is not unusual for bright, ambitious young Germans in the 1930s. He joins the Hitler Youth at age 11, immersing himself in the militaristic, racially supremacist ideology that the Nazi Party promotes. He's an excellent student, fluent in English and French, physically fit, ideologically committed. In 1934, at age 19, he joins the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization. This is before the SS becomes synonymous with genocide and war crimes, when it still presents itself as an ideological vanguard, a brotherhood of racial warriors dedicated to protecting Germany from its enemies. Peiper thrives in this environment. He's intelligent enough to impress his superiors, committed enough to be trusted with sensitive assignments, and ruthless enough to do what the SS increasingly requires, violence without hesitation or remorse. By 1938, at just 23 years old, Peiper has attracted the attention of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler himself. He's selected to serve as one of Himmler's personal adjutants, a position that places him at the very center of SS power. For 3 years, Peiper attends meetings where the extermination of European Jewry is discussed. He hears Himmler's speeches about the historic task of eliminating racial enemies. He witnesses the transformation of the SS from a political guard force into the primary instrument of Nazi genocide. This experience is critical to understanding what Peiper later becomes. He doesn't drift into war crimes through the fog of battle or the chaos of combat. He's ideologically prepared, systematically desensitized, deliberately shaped into an instrument of National Socialist violence. When Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, Peiper requests a combat assignment. He's given command of a company, then a battalion, in the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler the Führer's bodyguard division, an elite armoured formation. On the Eastern Front, Peiper distinguishes himself as a brilliant tactical commander. He's aggressive, decisive, and completely fearless. He leads from the front, personally commanding tanks in battle, exposing himself to fire in ways that earn his men's loyalty and his superiors' admiration. He wins the Iron Cross, then the German Cross in gold, then the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, among Germany's highest military decorations. By 1943, at 28 years old, he's commanding a full SS Panzer regiment. He's also accumulating a record of atrocities. The Eastern Front is where the Wehrmacht and SS learn to wage war without restraint. Soviet commissars and Jewish civilians are shot on sight under explicit orders. Villages suspected of supporting partisans are burned with their inhabitants trapped inside. Prisoners are routinely executed because guarding them diverts combat strength. Peiper's unit participates in these actions. In January 1943, during the Third Battle of Kharkov, his troops are documented burning Soviet villages and executing civilians. When Italian partisans kill 2 SS soldiers near the village of Baugnez, Italy, in September 1943, Peiper orders a reprisal. 23 Italian civilians shot, the entire village burned. These are not allegations. These are documented facts, recorded in after-action reports and witness statements. What's notable is not that Peiper commits these acts, many German officers on the Eastern Front do, but that they don't hurt his career. In the SS, ruthlessness is a virtue. By late 1944, when Peiper receives his orders for the Ardennes offensive, he's a perfect embodiment of Nazi military culture. He's tactically brilliant. His superiors trust him to accomplish missions that other commanders would consider impossible. His ideologically reliable years in the SS have inoculated him against moral qualms about killing enemies, combatants or civilians, armed or unarmed. He's operationally experienced. He's fought in France, Greece, Yugoslavia, Russia, and Italy, learning to move fast, hit hard, and ignore obstacles that might slow conventional commanders. And crucially, he's learned that atrocities work. Burning villages terrifies the civilian population, making them less likely to support partisans. Shooting prisoners removes the logistics burden of guarding them and sends a message to other enemy soldiers that surrender means death, sometimes making them flee rather than fight. In Peiper's calculus, shaped by 5 years of Eastern Front combat, war crimes are tactical tools. When SS General Sepp Dietrich briefs Peiper on his mission for the Ardennes offensive, the orders are explicit about priorities and implicit about methods. Peiper is to drive for the Meuse River with wave of terror and fright. He's told he must achieve breakthrough at all costs. He's told prisoners will slow his advance. Dietrich doesn't say kill all prisoners, but Peiper doesn't need explicit orders. He's spent years in a command climate where such actions are normal, where hesitation is weakness, where enemy lives have no value. When he briefs his own officers, survivors will later testify, he tells them, "We will not take prisoners. We cannot be burdened by prisoners." Some officers protest that this violates the Geneva Convention. Peiper's reported response is dismissive. This is the Eastern Front come to the West. The physical description of Peiper from later trial testimony is jarring because it contradicts expectations of what a war criminal should look like. He's 29 years old, slim, blonde, conventionally handsome. He speaks English with a slight accent, is unfailingly polite to interrogators, and presents himself with the cultivated manners of an educated European officer. American prosecutors expecting a slavering fanatic instead encounter a man who could be mistaken for a university professor or diplomat. This cognitive dissonance is important. Peiper is not a sadist who enjoys killing. He's something more dangerous, a true believer who has intellectualized violence, who has accepted Nazi ideology's premise that enemy lives are worthless, and who commits atrocities not in rage but in calm pursuit of military objectives. He kills prisoners the way another commander might destroy a bridge, as a tactical necessity. By December 17th, 1944, when Peiper's column approaches Malmedy, he's already 12 hours behind schedule. American resistance has been stiffer than expected. Fuel shortages are slowing his advance. Radio communication with higher headquarters has broken down. The entire offensive is beginning to look like it might fail. Peiper knows that every hour of delay means more American reinforcements arriving, means Allied air power potentially getting through the clouds to strafe his columns, means the strategic window for reaching the Meuse bridges closing. He's under enormous pressure, and he's learned over 5 years of combat on history's most brutal front that pressure is relieved through speed, and speed is achieved by removing obstacles, and prisoners are obstacles. The collision at Baugnez isn't random. It's the inevitable result of everything Joachim Peiper has become. December 17th, 1944, 12:57 p.m. The first Panther tank of Kampfgruppe Peiper rolls into the Baugnez Crossroads from the south, its commander scanning the intersection through his vision ports. What he sees must seem almost too good to be true. A full American convoy, 30 vehicles, caught in the open with nowhere to run. The Panther's 75mm gun swivels toward the lead American truck. Behind the tank, more German armor emerges from the snow half-tracks. Armored cars, more Panthers. The Americans have perhaps 20 seconds to understand what's happening before the Germans open fire. Those 20 seconds define the rest of their lives. Panic erupts along the American column. Soldiers jump from trucks, some grabbing weapons, most running for any cover they can find. But there is no cover. The Crossroads is surrounded by open fields, snow-covered and exposed. A few Americans try to return fire with carbines and pistols, but they're artillerymen with light weapons facing tanks and armored vehicles. It's not a fight. It's a slaughter waiting to happen. Captain Mills, the convoy commander, sees this immediately. He's a veteran officer, experienced enough to recognize hopeless tactical situations. Resistance will just get his men killed faster. He starts shouting for his soldiers to surrender, to put up white flags, to raise their hands. The order spreads through the column. Within 3 minutes of first contact, white flags are appearing, handkerchiefs, undershirts, anything white. The firing stops. German soldiers dismount from their half-tracks, moving quickly to secure the Americans. These are not Wehrmacht regulars. They're Waffen-SS, identifiable by their distinctive camouflage smocks and the double lightning bolt insignia on their collars. The Americans recognize the insignia. Everyone has heard stories about the SS, mostly from the Eastern Front, stories about brutality and fanaticism. But this is Belgium, not Russia. This is the Western Front, where the rules of war are supposedly still observed. The Germans begin herding prisoners toward a field adjacent to the Crossroads. Hands raised, the Americans comply. They're scared, but also relieved. They've survived the initial contact. They're prisoners now, which means they're protected by the Geneva Convention. The war is over for them. They just need to survive the next few hours, get processed, get sent to a POW camp. Some are already thinking about letters home, about sitting out the rest of the war, about the day they'll be liberated. The Germans continue gathering prisoners. By 1 o'clock, approximately 130 to 150 American soldiers are standing in a rough cluster in the snow-covered field. German soldiers move among them, searching for weapons, confiscating personal items. Watches are particularly popular. The Germans take almost every watch they find. Rings, too, cigarettes, money. This is illegal under the Geneva Convention, but it's also routine. Every army does it. The Americans stand with hands raised, getting colder, watching more German vehicles pass through the Crossroads, understanding with sinking certainty that they've stumbled into something much larger than a patrol or raiding party. This is a major German offensive. The implications are terrifying, but at least they're alive. 8 minutes pass. The prisoners wait. Some whisper to each other. Most stay silent. German soldiers stand guard, weapons ready, watching the cluster of Americans. Then 2 German armored cars maneuver into position at the edge of the field, their turrets rotating to bring machine guns to bear on the prisoners. Several more SS soldiers move to flanking positions. One officer walks to the front of the formation and draws his pistol. This is the moment when some of the Americans begin to understand. Private Homer Ford, standing near the middle of the group, feels his stomach drop. This isn't prisoner processing, this is an execution setup. But understanding and accepting are different things. His mind rejects what his eyes are seeing. Even now, with Germans positioning machine guns and drawing pistols, the idea that they're about to be murdered seems impossible. At approximately 1:15 p.m., the SS officer with the pistol raises it, aims at the nearest American soldier, and fires. The shot cracks across the field. The American falls. For one frozen second, absolute silence. Then the German machine guns open fire. The sound is overwhelming, MG-42s firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, the distinctive tearing cloth sound that veterans recognize instantly. Americans fall in waves, bodies collapsing into the snow. Some men try to run. They're cut down within steps. Others drop to the ground immediately, trying to play dead. The shooting is methodical, traversing back and forth across the field, ensuring coverage. Men scream. Some pray. Most die in seconds, torn apart by machine gun fire at close range. The initial burst of fire lasts perhaps 30 seconds. When it stops, the field is covered with bodies and wounded men. Some Americans are still alive, moaning, crying for help, trying to crawl. The Germans aren't finished. SS soldiers walk into the field among the bodies. They're carrying pistols and submachine guns. They move systematically, checking bodies, shooting anyone who shows signs of life. This is what the Germans call Gnadenschuss mercy shot, though there's no mercy in it. Wounded men beg for help. They're shot in the head. Men playing dead lie motionless, holding their breath, praying they won't be noticed. Some are shot anyway. The Germans are thorough. They walk through the entire field, shooting, checking, shooting again. This takes another 5 to 7 minutes. Private Homer Ford lies motionless as a German soldier approaches. He's been hit in the arm, but the wound isn't serious. He's playing dead, eyes closed, barely breathing. The German stands next to him. Ford can hear the breathing, can hear the boots in the snow, then weight on his back. The German is standing on him, using Ford's body as a platform to see across the field. Ford doesn't move, doesn't breathe. The German shifts his weight, then steps off and moves on. Ford survives. Corporal Virgil Larry watches the executions from where he fell, a dead soldier's body partly covering him. He sees Germans walking among the wounded, sees pistols raised and fired, sees men he's known for months jerking as bullets enter their skulls. He closes his eyes and waits. A German approaches, stands over him, moves on. Larry survives. By 1:27 p.m., the shooting has stopped. The Germans withdraw to their vehicles and continue their advance west. They leave 84 American soldiers dead in the snow and approximately 43 alive, either playing dead or hiding in the woods. The entire massacre, from first shot to German departure, has taken 12 minutes. 12 minutes to commit one of the war's most documented atrocities. 12 minutes that will be reconstructed in trial testimony, analysed by investigators, photographed for evidence, and remembered by survivors for the rest of their lives. The snow continues to fall lightly, beginning to cover the bodies. The temperature is 28 degrees. The bodies will freeze. They will remain in this field for 5 more weeks before American forces retake the area and discover what happened here. The survivors lie motionless for hours. Some are wounded. All are terrified. They can hear German vehicles passing on the nearby road, can hear German voices. Moving means death. So they wait in the snow, next to corpses, some of which are friends, growing colder, wondering if they'll freeze before the Germans leave. As twilight approaches around 4 p.m., the German presence diminishes. Small groups of survivors begin moving. Some crawl toward the woods, others run, expecting to be shot. Most make it. They navigate through German-held territory in the dark, following the sounds of American artillery to the north, stumbling into American lines throughout the night. Their stories, told and retold over the next 72 hours, will transform Malmedy from a place name into a symbol. But right now, in the gathering darkness of December 17th, they're just cold, traumatized men trying to survive, carrying the knowledge of what they witnessed. Testimony that will eventually bring SS officers to trial and force the American military to confront one of its most challenging questions. How do you achieve justice for war crimes when your own investigation methods violate the same principles you're trying to uphold? December 17th, 1944, 4:30 p.m. Private Homer Ford begins crawling through the snow. He's been lying motionless for 3 hours, surrounded by corpses, listening to German vehicles pass on the nearby road. His arm throbs where a bullet grazed it. His fingers have no feeling. He can't stop shaking, though whether from cold or shock or terror he doesn't know. Around him, other bodies are beginning to move. Not many, maybe 15 or 20 out of the 130 who stood in this field. The rest are dead, or so convincingly playing dead that Ford can't tell the difference. He crawls toward the tree line 50 yards away, expecting at any moment to hear German voices, to feel bullets, to die like the others. He reaches the trees. He's alive. For now. The survivors' escape stories vary in detail, but share common elements of terror, chance, and desperate improvisation. Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens ran during the initial shooting, sprinting toward the woods, while machine gun fire cut down men on either side of him. He felt bullets pass close enough to hear. He crashed into the tree line, fell into a small ravine, and lay there shaking while Germans methodically shot the wounded in the field. He waited until dark, then began walking north, navigating by the sound of distant artillery. Corporal Virgil Larry played dead for the longest, nearly 4 hours. A corpse fell across him during the initial shooting, providing partial cover. He lay beneath this dead friend while Germans walked past multiple times, shooting survivors. When he finally moved at dusk, his clothes were frozen to the ground. He had to tear himself free, leaving fabric behind. Not all escape attempts succeeded. Some men who ran during the initial shooting were cut down immediately. Others, wounded and unable to move quickly, were discovered and shot during the Germans' systematic sweep through the field. A few tried to surrender a second time, raising hands and calling out in German, pleading for mercy. They were executed on the spot. The survivors who escaped did so through a combination of luck, stillness, and timing. Those who remained motionless the longest generally survived. Those who moved too soon died. It was chance more than skill, random fortune rather than tactical brilliance. Ford survived because a German happened to step on him rather than shoot him. Larry survived because a corpse fell in the right position to shield him. Ahrens survived because bullets that killed the men beside him somehow missed him. The journey to American lines was nearly as dangerous as the massacre itself. The survivors were scattered across several square miles of German-controlled territory. Most were wounded. All were in shock. Night was falling. Temperature dropping below 20 degrees. They were artillerymen, not infantry trained in navigation and fieldcraft. Many had no clear idea where American lines were, navigating only by instinct and the sound of guns. Private Ford walked north for 5 hours before stumbling into an American position. He was challenged by a sentry who nearly shot him, mistaking him for a German infiltrator. Ford collapsed, crying, unable to stop shaking, unable to speak clearly. The sentry took him to a company command post where an officer sat him down with coffee and tried to get his story. The reaction to survivors' initial reports was skepticism. This was December 17th, less than 36 hours into the German offensive. American units were scattered, confused, receiving fragmentary reports about German breakthroughs everywhere. Soldiers stumbling in from the darkness telling stories about mass execution seemed more likely to be in shock, exaggerating combat into atrocity. The first officer to hear Ford's account asked him repeatedly if he was certain, if maybe he'd misunderstood what happened, if perhaps the Germans had opened fire on a prisoner column that was trying to escape. Ford's insistence that this was deliberate murder of surrendered men standing with hands raised seemed almost too terrible to believe. By late evening December 17th and throughout December 18th, more survivors reached American lines. Each told the same story with slight variations. Surrender, herding into a field, searching, waiting, then systematic execution. The consistency of these accounts forced American intelligence to take them seriously. By December 18th afternoon, at least 20 survivors had been debriefed. Their testimony was remarkably coherent for men in extreme trauma. They described SS insignia on the Germans. They described the number and types of German vehicles. Several identified the distinctive markings of 1st SS Panzer Division. Some even reported hearing German officers' names being shouted. This wasn't confused combat memory. This was detailed, cross-corroborated witness testimony to war crimes. The military intelligence teams documenting these testimonies understood they were recording evidence for potential war crimes trials. Survivors were interviewed separately to prevent collusion. Details were checked and cross-referenced. The accounts aligned too closely to be fabrication. The survivors described things they couldn't have known to coordinate specific German vehicle numbers, particular officers' appearances, the sequence of events. Within 72 hours of the massacre, American intelligence had compiled sworn statements from approximately 30 survivors. These statements included hand-drawn maps showing positions in the field, descriptions of where bodies fell, estimates of how many Germans were present. It was the most detailed documentation of a war crime compiled so far in the European theatre. The survivors themselves struggled with what they'd witnessed. Several broke down during questioning, unable to continue. Others displayed flat affect, answering questions mechanically, showing little emotion. Some were angry, demanding to know when the Americans would kill SS prisoners in retaliation. Most just seemed shattered, unable to process how surrender, which was supposed to mean safety, under the Geneva Convention had instead meant methodical murder. The psychological trauma was immediate and obvious. Several survivors had to be sedated. Others refused to sleep, experiencing what would later be recognized as acute stress reactions. A few requested immediate return to combat duty, saying they needed to fight back, needed to do something rather than sit and remember. The significance of survivor testimony cannot be overstated. Without them, Malmedy would have been just another wartime atrocity suspected but never proven, rumoured but never documented. The bodies frozen in the field would have been discovered eventually, but without witnesses determining exactly what happened would have been nearly impossible. Were they killed in combat? During an escape attempt? By stray fire? Survivor testimony transformed those questions into certainties. They could say exactly what happened because they were there, because they survived by pretending to be among the dead, because they lay in the snow and watched SS soldiers murder their friends. Their accounts would become the foundation of the largest American war crimes prosecution in the European theatre. By December 19th, news of Malmedy was spreading through the American military. The survivors' testimony was being shared up the chain of command, reaching division headquarters, corps headquarters, eventually Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. General Eisenhower was briefed. So was General Bradley. The reaction was fury. Not just at the Germans for committing the atrocity, but at themselves for being caught so completely by surprise that American soldiers could be massacred behind what had been, 48 hours earlier, secure lines. Malmedy became both a rallying cry and an embarrassment. It proved SS brutality, but it also proved American unpreparedness. Within days, orders would go out to all American units. Take note of what happened at Malmedy. Remember when you encounter SS troops. And the survivors, traumatized and struggling, would find themselves transformed from victims into witnesses whose testimony might bring war criminals to justice if they could endure telling their story again and again in investigations and trials that would consume the next decade. January 14th, 1945, 9:30 a.m. Lieutenant Virgil Larey stands at the edge of the field at Baugnez, looking at the snow-covered ground where he nearly died 29 days ago. He's returned as part of an American investigation team, guiding them to the exact location of the massacre. The Crossroads has changed hands twice since December 17th. German forces held it for weeks during the height of the Ardennes offensive, then American units retook it in early January as the German attack collapsed. Now, investigators need to document what happened here. Larry points to the field. There, he says quietly, that's where we stood. The investigators move forward, and within minutes they're staring at something that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The bodies are exactly where they fell. 29 days in sub-freezing temperatures has preserved them perfectly, frozen in the positions they occupied at the moment of death. Some lie face down in the snow, arms outstretched as if trying to crawl. Others are on their backs, arms raised defensively. A cluster near the center of the field shows men who fell together, bodies piled against each other. From a distance, they look like dark logs scattered across white ground. Up close, they're clearly human, frozen solid, covered in a light layer of snow, but unmistakably corpses. The investigators begin counting. 10 bodies, 20, 40. The count continues. When they finish, they've identified 84 dead American soldiers. The scene is a forensic investigator's nightmare and dream simultaneously. Nightmare because of the horror. These are young men frozen in their death agonies, some with expressions of terror still visible on their faces. Dream because the cold has preserved everything. In a normal crime scene, evidence degrades, bodies decompose, Spent shell casings rust, blood washes away. Here, nothing has changed. The field is exactly as it was on December 17th, minus only the living witnesses. Snow has covered some details, but preserved others. The investigators begin their work methodically, photographing everything, measuring distances, collecting evidence. This will become one of the most thoroughly documented war crime scenes in military history. The forensic evidence tells the massacre story with terrible clarity. Spent shell casings are everywhere, hundreds of them scattered across the snow. The investigators identify 7.92mm Mauser casings from German pistols, 9mm casings from MP40 submachine guns, and larger casings from the MG42 machine guns that did most of the killing. The distribution pattern shows the machine guns fired from two positions at the field's edge, their fire traversing back and forth across the standing prisoners. The pistol and submachine gun casings are scattered throughout the field itself, confirming survivor testimony about Germans walking among the bodies, shooting the wounded. Some casings are found within inches of corpses, indicating point-blank range executions. Medical examination of the bodies provides even more damning evidence. Each corpse is carefully examined, wounds documented, bullets or bullet fragments recovered when possible. The findings are systematic and chilling. Approximately 70% of the victims show evidence of what German military doctors call Gnadenschuss, mercy shots, though there's nothing merciful about them. These are close-range head wounds, typically at the base of the skull or through the temple, fired from pistols or submachine guns. The trajectory analysis shows these shots were fired downward into victims already on the ground. This isn't combat fire, this is execution. Wounded men lying helpless in the snow, systematically murdered. The personal effects missing from the bodies corroborate another aspect of survivor testimony. Almost none of the dead have watches, rings, or cigarettes. The Germans stripped them before the shooting. This detail matters legally because it demonstrates premeditation. The Germans didn't fire on prisoners in panic or self-defense. They captured them, disarmed them, searched them, robbed them, and then executed them. Each step shows deliberation. Each action proves this wasn't a spontaneous battlefield incident, but a calculated war crime. The investigators carefully document every missing watch, every empty pocket, building an evidence file that will eventually include hundreds of pages of forensic detail. Photography becomes crucial to preserving evidence. US Army Signal Corps photographers arrive with large format cameras and begin the grim work of documenting every body from multiple angles. They photograph the field from various positions, showing the overall scene. They photograph individual corpses, showing wound patterns and positions. They photograph spent shell casings in place before collecting them. They photograph the frozen ground, the surrounding terrain, the sight lines from German firing positions. Over 2 days, they expose more than 50 photographic plates. These images will become exhibits at trial, graphic, undeniable proof of what happened at Baugnez. Some are so disturbing that even hardened military prosecutors struggle to look at them. The recovery of bodies is a separate challenge. The corpses are frozen solid, some stuck to the ground, their uniforms ice-bonded to the earth. Recovery teams use picks and shovels to free them, trying to maintain dignity while working in sub-zero temperatures. Each body is photographed in place, then carefully excavated, then transported to a temporary morgue for formal identification. Dog tags are frozen to skin, wallets are ice-solid blocks. The men's faces are preserved by the cold but distorted by death and freezing, making identification difficult. Dental records and fingerprints become the primary identification methods. Families will eventually be notified, but right now these are evidence, not yet returned sons. Lieutenant Larry moves through the field, helping investigators understand the sequence of events. He points to where he stood before the shooting started. He shows where he fell, where the corpse landed on top of him, providing cover. He identifies friends among the dead men he served with, joked with, who died 3 feet from where he survived through sheer chance. The investigators ask him to repeat his account multiple times, checking details against physical evidence. Everything aligns. His testimony, given initially in shock the night of December 17th, matches what they're finding in the field. This consistency is powerful evidence. Trauma victims often misremember details, but Larry's account is forensically accurate. The documentation continues for nearly a week. Investigators expand their search beyond the immediate massacre site, discovering additional bodies in the surrounding woods. Americans who were shot while trying to escape, who made it a few hundred yards before being hunted down. They find spent ammunition from German weapons along the tree line, suggesting Germans pursued fleeing prisoners and shot them as they ran. They interview Belgian civilians from nearby farms who heard the shooting, who saw German soldiers in the field afterward, who can provide additional timeline confirmation. Every detail is recorded, every witness statement taken, every piece of physical evidence collected and catalogued. By January 20th, the investigation team has compiled an overwhelming evidence file, 84 confirmed dead American soldiers, all killed after surrendering, most showing evidence of execution-style head wounds delivered to incapacitated victims, hundreds of spent German shell casings proving systematic shooting, survivor testimony from 43 men describing the same sequence of events, Belgian civilian witnesses confirming the timeline, forensic evidence demonstrating premeditation and deliberation, and photographs, dozens of photographs showing frozen corpses in a snowy field, images so powerful they will become synonymous with Nazi war crimes. The field at Baugnez has been transformed from a crime scene into a legal case. The evidence is irrefutable. Now comes the harder question: finding the perpetrators and bringing them to justice. December 19th, 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. General Dwight Eisenhower reads the preliminary report on the Malmedy massacre with mounting fury. 72 hours ago, the largest German offensive since 1940 had smashed into American lines, catching his intelligence staff completely by surprise. Now, he's learning that SS troops are executing American prisoners in the field. The report includes sworn statements from survivors describing systematic murder. Eisenhower calls for his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, and dictates an immediate communication to all Allied commands. The substance is clear. American forces are to be informed about German atrocities and to understand what they're facing. What Eisenhower cannot know is that his justified outrage is about to unleash a propaganda campaign that will transform battlefield behavior for the remainder of the European war. The official communication goes out on December 20th. Every division, every regiment, every battalion in the European theatre receives notification about Malmedy. The message is carefully worded. It describes the massacre as a war crime, orders documentation of any similar incidents, and reminds commanders that the Geneva Convention still applies to American forces. But the message's subtext is unmistakable. The SS has shown it takes no prisoners, so American soldiers should be appropriately cautious. Within hours, this official communication is being interpreted, reinterpreted, and transformed by soldiers who are cold, scared, and now learning that surrender to the SS might mean execution. The transformation from information to rallying cry happens almost organically. By December 22nd, 3 days after Eisenhower's communication, the phrase "Avenge Malmedy" begins appearing on American equipment. Tankers chalk it on their Sherman's gun tubes. Artillery crews paint it on shells before loading them. Infantry soldiers scratch it into helmets, rifle stocks, entrenching tools. No one orders this. No official directive tells soldiers to adopt "Avenge Malmedy" as a slogan. It emerges spontaneously from a combination of rage, fear, and the soldiers' need to impose meaning on chaos. The Ardennes offensive has shaken American confidence. The Germans weren't supposed to be capable of this kind of attack anymore. Malmedy provides a focus for anger, a way to transform defensive confusion into offensive motivation. The psychological impact on American troops is immediate and measurable. Before Malmedy, American soldiers generally accepted German surrenders without question, distinguishing between Wehrmacht regulars, who were seen as professional soldiers following orders, and SS troops, who had a reputation for fanaticism but were still taken prisoner when they surrendered. After Malmedy, that distinction sharpens into something more lethal. SS troops attempting to surrender increasingly find their white flags ignored. Documentation of this shift is fragmentary. Soldiers don't write home about refusing to accept surrenders, and unit after-action reports rarely mention such incidents explicitly. But the statistical evidence is clear. The percentage of SS troops taken prisoner relative to Wehrmacht troops drops dramatically after mid-December 1944. The numbers tell a grim story. During the summer and fall of 1944, roughly 50% of German prisoners taken by American forces were SS troops, proportional to SS representation in German formations facing the Americans. By January and February 1945, that percentage drops to roughly 10 to 15%. The SS units haven't disappeared, they're still fighting, often comprising the last effective German combat formations, but they're not surrendering in the same numbers, and when they try, they're not being taken prisoner. What's changed is American willingness to accept SS surrenders. Multiple veterans will later admit in oral history interviews that their units had informal policies about SS prisoners after Malmedy. Don't take them if you can avoid it. The propaganda value of Malmedy extends beyond the immediate battlefield. By December 23rd, American newspapers are publishing accounts of the massacre, their details censored for security, but their essence clear. German SS troops murdered over 80 American prisoners in cold blood. The headlines use words like atrocity, massacre, Nazi, barbarity. The stories are accompanied by assurances that the perpetrators will be brought to justice, that this crime will not go unpunished. For the American home front, still processing the shock that Germany could launch a major offensive this late in the war, Malmedy reinforces why they're fighting. These aren't honourable enemies. These are war criminals who deserve no mercy. Allied propaganda units quickly incorporate Malmedy into psychological warfare operations. Leaflets dropped over German positions reference the massacre, warning German soldiers that SS atrocities are hardening Allied resolve. Some leaflets specifically target Wehrmacht troops trying to drive a wedge between regular army units and the SS by emphasizing SS war crimes. The message is calculated: surrender to American forces is safe if you're Wehrmacht, but if you're SS, you've forfeited the protection of the Geneva Convention through your own actions. This is propaganda, but it's propaganda with a factual basis. The SS has committed atrocities. American anger is genuine. The leaflets simply exploit existing truths for military advantage. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt are both briefed on Malmedy within days of the massacre. Both demand thorough documentation for eventual war crimes trials. Churchill, who has been pushing for aggressive prosecution of Nazi war criminals since early in the war, sees Malmedy as vindication of his position that the SS is a criminal organization that must be tried and punished as such. Roosevelt, facing increasing pressure from some quarters to negotiate with Germany, now that the Reich is clearly losing, uses Malmedy as evidence that negotiation is impossible. These are not people you negotiate with. These are criminals you defeat and prosecute. The strategic impact of the Avenge Malmedy campaign is difficult to quantify, but clearly significant. American soldiers who might have been demoralized by the German offensive instead channel their fear into aggression. The initial days of the Ardennes battle saw American units breaking and retreating in confusion. By late December, American resistance has stiffened dramatically. Part of this is reinforcements arriving, better weather allowing air support, and German logistics breaking down. But part of it is also psychological. American soldiers now have a personal stake in defeating the SS, a narrative that transforms them from victims of a surprise attack into avengers of a war crime. The moral cost of this propaganda victory is substantial but largely unexamined during the war itself. American soldiers who refuse to accept SS surrenders are committing war crimes themselves, however understandable their motivation. The Geneva Convention doesn't include exceptions for enemy atrocities. Every American soldier who shoots an SS trooper trying to surrender is technically guilty of the same crime the SS committed at Malmedy. But these incidents aren't prosecuted, they're barely documented. The official military position is that SS troops are killed in combat, not murdered after surrender. Everyone understands the reality is more complicated, but no one wants to examine it too closely. Avenging Malmedy has become both a moral imperative and a moral compromise. Justifiable in context, but corrosive to the principles it claims to defend. December 16th, 1944, 6:15 a.m. Honsveld, Belgium. The American soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division wake to German artillery fire that tears through their positions with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, German tanks are rolling into the small Belgian town, crushing defensive positions, firing point-blank into buildings where Americans have taken cover. By 7 a.m., Honsveld has fallen. American survivors are being gathered in the town square, hands raised, surrendering to SS troops of Kampfgruppe Peiper. By 7:30, 19 of these prisoners are dead, shot against a wall while Belgian civilians watch from windows. This is the first massacre committed by Peiper's unit during the Ardennes offensive. It will not be the last. Malmedy, which occurs 30 hours later, is not an aberration. It's part of a pattern. The trail of atrocities committed by Kampfgruppe Peiper during their 8-day advance through Belgium is extensive and well documented. At Bulge, shortly after Honsfeld, 8 more American prisoners are murdered. The killings follow a similar pattern: capture, brief detention, then execution by small arms fire. No pretense of combat, no suggestion that prisoners were attempting escape. They're simply shot because guarding them would slow the German advance. The executions occur in front of witnesses, other prisoners who are kept alive for labour purposes, Belgian civilians who see but cannot intervene. These witnesses will later provide testimony that establishes the systematic nature of the killings. Ligneville presents the most complex crime scene because the victims include both American soldiers and Belgian civilians. The town falls to Kampfgruppe Peiper on December 17th, the same day as the Malmedy massacre but several hours earlier in the morning. American defenders retreat, but approximately 60 soldiers and civilians are caught in the German advance. They're gathered at the Hôtel du Moulin, the town's main building. What happens next is chaos. Some victims are shot trying to flee, others are executed in the hotel basement, still others are killed in the street. By the time Peiper's troops move on, 58 people are dead. The mixture of military and civilian victims demonstrates that the killing is indiscriminate, driven more by convenience than military necessity. Stavelot becomes the site of the worst civilian massacre. On December 18th and 19th, as American resistance stiffens and Peiper's advance stalls, SS troops turn on the Belgian population. Approximately 130 civilians are murdered over 2 days. The victims include women and children, entire families killed in their homes. Some are shot. Others are burned alive when SS troops set fire to buildings with people trapped inside. The killings serve no military purpose. Stavelot is already under German control. The civilians pose no threat. This is retribution, frustration vented on helpless victims, or perhaps simply the logical endpoint of an ideology that classifies non-Germans as subhuman and therefore expendable. At Chenot, another Belgian village in Peiper's path, 40 civilians die in similar circumstances. Houses are burned with families inside. Those who flee the flames are shot. The pattern repeats. German forces encountering resistance or delay take out their frustration on whatever victims are available. The Geneva Convention supposedly protects civilians in occupied territory, but the SS operates under different rules. Years of Eastern Front experience have taught Peiper's men that burning villages and killing civilians is normal, that terror works, that massacre is a tactical option. They're bringing Eastern Front methods to Western Europe, applying to Belgian Catholics the same ruthlessness previously reserved for Russian Orthodox and Polish Jews. The total accounting of Kampfgruppe Peiper's atrocities during the Ardennes offensive is staggering. 84 American soldiers at Malmedy, 19 at Honsfeld, 8 at Bulge, 58 mixed military and civilian at Ligneville, 130 civilians at Stavelot, 40 at Chenot, dozens more at smaller locations along their route. Conservative estimates place the total number of victims at approximately 350 people murdered by Peiper's unit during 8 days of operations. This doesn't include combat deaths, which are legitimate in war. These are prisoners executed after surrender, civilians murdered in occupied territory, unarmed people killed in circumstances that clearly constitute war crimes under any definition. The geographic scope of these atrocities creates an investigative challenge. The crimes are spread across 30 miles of Belgian countryside, occurring at different times, witnessed by different people, involving different perpetrators. Some sites are well documented with multiple witnesses, others have only fragmentary evidence. American investigators trying to build war crimes cases face the problem of connecting individual perpetrators to specific crimes. Most of the killings were committed by small groups of SS soldiers, not by the entire Kampfgruppe. Establishing who specifically shot whom, where, and when requires painstaking reconstruction of the unit's movement, cross-referencing German unit records with witness testimony and physical evidence. The question of command responsibility becomes central to any legal strategy. Joachim Peiper cannot have personally committed all these murders. He was commanding the entire Kampfgruppe, dealing with combat operations, fuel shortages, American resistance. At most of the massacre sites, he was physically absent, sometimes miles away, but legally that may not matter. If Peiper created a command climate that encouraged atrocities, if he gave orders that explicitly or implicitly authorized killing prisoners, if he knew about the murders and failed to stop them or punish the perpetrators, he can be held responsible under the doctrine of command responsibility. The challenge is proving what Peiper knew and when he knew it. Belgian civilian testimony provides crucial evidence, but also complications. The witnesses are traumatized, often describing events they saw while hiding or fleeing. Their accounts are emotionally powerful, but sometimes imprecise, about details like timing, unit identification, or individual German soldiers' identities. They can testify that SS troops committed the murders. The distinctive uniforms and insignia are unmistakable. But connecting specific SS soldiers to specific killings requires more than just identifying them as members of Peiper's unit. American investigators spend months in Belgium interviewing survivors, examining crime scenes, building cases that will eventually include hundreds of witness statements. The pattern of atrocities committed by Kampfgruppe Peiper raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of the SS and the German military more broadly. Were these crimes the result of explicit orders from higher command? Were they Peiper's initiative, based on his Eastern Front experience and understanding that speed mattered more than adherence to the laws of war? Or were they spontaneous actions by individual SS soldiers who had internalized Nazi ideology so thoroughly that murder seemed natural? The answer is probably all three. The command climate encouraged ruthlessness. Peiper's leadership demonstrated that atrocities wouldn't be punished, and individual soldiers, ideologically indoctrinated and brutalized by years of war, committed murder when opportunity arose. The result was a 30-mile trail of blood through Belgium, January 7th, 1945, near Stavelot, Belgium. An American infantry company from the 30th Infantry Division encounters a group of surrendering SS soldiers, hands raised, weapons discarded, clearly attempting to give themselves up. The company commander, a captain who has been in combat since Normandy, faces a decision. His men know about Malmedy, they've seen the propaganda leaflets, they've chalked Avenge Malmedy on their helmets. More immediately, they've just spent the last week fighting house to house against these same SS troops, taking casualties, watching friends die. Now the SS want to surrender. The captain has perhaps 30 seconds to decide what kind of war he's fighting. What he chooses in this moment will determine whether he maintains the moral high ground his country claims to occupy, or whether he descends to the enemy's level. The captain accepts the surrender. He orders his men to disarm the Germans, secure them, and move them to the rear for processing. Several soldiers protest. One sergeant points out that these are SS troops, the same organization that murdered American prisoners at Malmedy. The captain acknowledges this but says the Geneva Convention doesn't include exceptions for enemy atrocities. The SS soldiers are prisoners now, entitled to protection. The company moves on. This captain's decision represents the ideal American forces maintaining legal and moral standards, even when dealing with an enemy who has violated those same standards. But not every American officer makes this choice, and the exceptions, though rarely documented officially, accumulate into a moral crisis that the American military would prefer not to examine too closely. The reality of American conduct after Malmedy is complex and uncomfortable. In many cases, American soldiers continue following the rules of war, accepting SS surrenders, treating German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. But in other cases, documented through post-war interviews and fragmentary evidence, American forces commit what can only be called reprisal killings. SS troops attempting to surrender are shot. German prisoners are accidentally killed during transport. Wounded SS soldiers are left to die rather than given medical treatment. These incidents are never officially acknowledged, rarely appear in after-action reports, and are almost never prosecuted. But they happen, and they represent a fundamental contradiction. How can America prosecute German war crimes while committing its own? The Army chaplain's reports provide some of the most revealing evidence about American moral struggles. Chaplains, bound by confessional privilege, record patterns without identifying specific individuals. Beginning in late December 1944 and continuing through early 1945, chaplains' reports show a significant increase in soldiers confessing to killing German prisoners. The confessions follow similar patterns: encounter with SS troops, knowledge of Malmedy, decision that these particular Germans didn't deserve protection, execution. The soldiers expressing these confessions are often seeking absolution, struggling with what they've done, even as they believe it was justified. They're caught between two moral frameworks: the legal framework that says all prisoners must be protected, and the retributive framework that says Malmedy deserves punishment. Military justice statistics from this period are revealing in their absence. Between December 1944 and May 1945, exactly 0 American soldiers are court-martialed for killing SS prisoners of war. This is statistically impossible if American forces are scrupulously following the Geneva Convention. Surrendering enemy soldiers are killed in every war, sometimes in the chaos of combat, sometimes deliberately. The complete absence of prosecutions suggests either inhuman perfection or deliberate blindness. The Army's unofficial policy seems to be, we know it's happening, we understand why it's happening, and we're going to look the other way because prosecuting American soldiers for killing SS troops after Malmedy would be politically and morally untenable. The comparison with German conduct is both obvious and problematic. Obviously, what American forces may have done, refusing some SS surrenders, committing some reprisal killings, pales in comparison to systematic SS atrocities. The scale is different, the intent is different. The SS killed prisoners as policy, as tactical convenience, as ideological imperative. American killings of SS prisoners were individual acts, limited in scope, driven by revenge rather than doctrine. But legally and morally, this distinction may not matter. The Geneva Convention doesn't have a footnote saying, unless the enemy started it, murder of prisoners is murder of prisoners, regardless of justification or scale. The question of whether retributive justice is justice at all becomes central. From one perspective, Americans killing SS troops after Malmedy represents justice, the perpetrators facing consequences from their victims' comrades. The SS chose to abandon the rules of war, and they're reaping what they sowed. From another perspective, it's corruption, Americans abandoning their own principles, becoming what they're fighting against, perpetuating rather than ending atrocity. Both perspectives have validity. The American soldiers refusing SS surrenders genuinely believe they're avenging murdered comrades. They're also genuinely violating international law. These facts coexist uncomfortably. Post-war psychological studies add another dimension to understanding. Research conducted on Second World War veterans in the 1950s and 60s reveals that approximately 60 to 70% of surveyed combat veterans admitted witnessing or participating in what they themselves classified as war crimes. These admissions include killing prisoners, shooting wounded enemies, firing on civilians in certain circumstances. The percentages are consistent across different armies: American, British, German, Soviet. What this suggests is that war crime is not an aberration committed only by uniquely evil organizations like the SS. It's a persistent feature of armed conflict that emerges under stress, fear, anger, and the breakdown of normal moral constraints that combat produces. The difference, perhaps, lies not in whether atrocities occur, but in how military organizations respond to them. The German military, and particularly the SS, created a command climate that encouraged atrocities, rewarded ruthlessness, and never punished war crimes against designated enemy groups. The American military officially prohibited atrocities, maintained the Geneva Convention as binding, and at least theoretically enforced rules against prisoner abuse. That American soldiers sometimes violated these rules doesn't make the rules meaningless, but it does raise questions about how seriously those rules were taken when enforcement was selective and prosecution was absent. The moral quagmire deepens when examining specific cases. In April 1945, American troops liberating Dachau concentration camp discover the full horror of Nazi genocide. SS guards at the camp attempt to surrender. American soldiers, looking at emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, at survivors barely alive, at evidence of systematic extermination, shoot the surrendering guards. Approximately 50 SS men are killed after attempting to give themselves up. This is documented, photographed, witnessed. No one is prosecuted. Were these war crimes? Legally, yes. Morally, the question becomes harder. The SS guards at Dachau participated in genocide, their victims numbered in the tens of thousands. Do they deserve Geneva Convention protection? American law says yes. American soldiers, faced with the evidence of what these men enabled, said no. The legacy of these moral compromises extends far beyond the Second World War. Every subsequent American conflict has grappled with the tension between maintaining legal standards and responding to enemy atrocities. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, each has produced situations where American forces faced enemies who violated the rules of war, and each has produced American responses that sometimes crossed legal lines. The pattern established after Malmedy: official adherence to standards, unofficial tolerance of violations when the enemy is particularly brutal, repeats across decades. The uncomfortable truth is that maintaining moral purity in total war may be impossible. The question is whether acknowledging this reality leads to better outcomes than pretending it doesn't exist. December 17th, 1944, 1:14 p.m., 60 seconds before the shooting starts. An SS officer stands at the edge of the snow-covered field, looking at approximately 130 American prisoners. Behind him, 2 armored cars have positioned their machine guns to cover the cluster of men. German soldiers have taken up flanking positions. The scene is set for execution, but in this 60-second window, the massacre hasn't happened yet. The officer could still order the prisoners marched to a holding area. He could assign guards and continue the advance. That decision, made in less time than it takes to read this paragraph, will determine whether he's remembered as a soldier or a war criminal. The question historians have grappled with for decades is, what made this particular decision inevitable? The immediate tactical calculation is brutally simple. Guarding 130 prisoners requires at minimum 20 to 30 soldiers, roughly a full infantry platoon. These guards would need to march the prisoners back to German lines, a journey of several hours through contested territory, then hand them off to rear echelon units for processing. Meanwhile, Kampfgruppe Peiper is already 12 hours behind schedule. Every soldier diverted to guard duty is one fewer soldier available for combat. Every hour spent processing prisoners is an hour American reinforcements use to prepare defenses. The arithmetic of atrocity is cold. Killing the prisoners takes 12 minutes and 0 soldiers for guard duty, while processing them properly takes half a day and 30 men. From a purely military perspective, focused solely on maintaining advance speed, murder is the efficient option. But efficiency alone doesn't explain the massacre. German forces throughout the war captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners without executing them. Wehrmacht units facing similar time pressure found ways to process prisoners without mass murder. The specific decision at Malmedy requires understanding not just the tactical situation, but the ideological framework within which SS troops operated. For soldiers indoctrinated in Nazi racial theory, American prisoners are not fellow soldiers deserving respect under international law. They're racially inferior enemies whose lives have no intrinsic value. This ideology, combined with tactical pressure, creates conditions where massacre becomes not just possible but almost natural. The command climate established by Joachim Peiper is crucial to understanding how individual soldiers made the choice to participate in murder. Peiper never issues a direct order saying, "Kill all prisoners at Baugnez." No such order exists in written records or witness testimony, but he doesn't need to. He's spent the previous 24 hours creating an atmosphere where atrocities are implicitly approved. His troops have already murdered American prisoners at Honsfeld and Bulge. No one has been punished. No one has been reprimanded. The message is clear. Killing prisoners won't have negative consequences. For soldiers operating this command climate, the question isn't, is it legal to shoot prisoners? It's, does the commander care if we shoot prisoners? And the answer, demonstrated through inaction, is no. The individual psychology of the German soldiers who pulled triggers is complex. Post-war research into how ordinary people commit atrocities, from the Holocaust to Rwanda to Bosnia, reveals consistent patterns. Most perpetrators aren't sadists who enjoy killing. They're normal people placed in situations where several factors combine to make murder psychologically possible. First, authority. When a superior officer creates an environment where killing is acceptable, individuals feel permission. Second, conformity. When everyone else in your unit is participating, refusing feels like betrayal of comrades. Third, dehumanization. When victims are classified as subhuman enemies, empathy is suspended. Fourth, distance. Machine guns fired from 50 yards create psychological distance that makes killing easier than pistols fired at arm's length. The German soldiers who committed the Malmedy massacre exhibited all these psychological enablers. They were following the implicit guidance of commanders they respected. They were acting as part of a group, not as isolated individuals. They had been taught through ideology and experience that American soldiers were enemies, unworthy of protection. And The mechanics of the killing, machine guns fired from a distance, victims who were strangers, provided psychological buffer. Understanding these factors doesn't excuse the crime, but it helps explain how normal young German men, not fundamentally different from the Americans they murdered, were able to participate in atrocity without immediate psychological breakdown. The specific decision-maker at Baugnez was likely SS Major Werner Puchka, Peiper's second-in-command, who was leading the column elements that captured Battery B. Puchka had combat authority to make tactical decisions without consulting Peiper, who was several kilometers ahead dealing with the advance. When Puchka encountered 130 American prisoners at a crossroads, he faced the exact tactical problem Peiper had told his officers to avoid, being slowed by prisoners. Puchka's solution was execution. This wasn't spontaneous. The systematic setup, the positioning of machine guns, the methodical shooting of wounded, all demonstrate planning. But it was also probably not directly ordered by Peiper in the moment. It was initiative, a subordinate commander solving a problem using methods the command climate had established as acceptable. The role of ideology cannot be overstated. Wehrmacht soldiers, even those who were National Socialists, generally maintained some adherence to military tradition that included respect for brave enemies and protection for prisoners. The SS operated under different principles. They were political soldiers, warriors of National Socialism, explicitly tasked with missions that regular military organizations wouldn't accept. On the Eastern Front, this meant participating in genocide, burning villages, executing commissars, and Jewish civilians. The SS learned that the rules of war didn't apply to them, that atrocity was acceptable when serving ideological goals. Bringing this Eastern Front mentality to Western Europe meant treating American prisoners the way they treated Russian prisoners, as obstacles to be eliminated. The comparison with other battlefield situations where German forces faced similar tactical pressures illuminates the SS's distinctiveness. In Normandy, Wehrmacht units captured thousands of American paratroopers who had dropped behind German lines. Processing these prisoners was tactically inconvenient, but they were processed, not murdered. During the Battle of the Bulge, Wehrmacht units captured over 8,000 Americans from the 106th Infantry Division. These prisoners were marched to POW camps, not executed. The difference wasn't the tactical situation, it was the organization. Wehrmacht units, though fighting for Nazi Germany, largely retained professional military standards about prisoner treatment. The SS had abandoned those standards systematically. The legal question that would later dominate war crimes trials was whether commanders could be held responsible for crimes they didn't directly order. Peiper was not at Baugnez when the shooting occurred. He didn't pull a trigger. He may not even have known about the massacre until hours or days later. But legally, his responsibility could be established through command climate. If his orders, instructions, and prior inaction created an environment where subordinates understood that killing prisoners was acceptable, then he bears command responsibility for those killings. This legal doctrine, applied at Nuremberg and in subsequent war crimes trials, recognizes that mass atrocities don't happen without institutional support, that commanders who create climates enabling war crimes are as culpable as the individuals who pull triggers. The anatomy of the Malmedy massacre reveals how institutional evil requires both systematic preparation and individual choice. The systematic preparation came from years of Nazi indoctrination, Eastern Front experience normalizing atrocities, and command guidance emphasizing speed over legal niceties. The individual choices came at the moment when specific German soldiers decided to follow implicit orders rather than resist them, to participate in murder rather than object. Both elements were necessary. Without ideology and command climate, individual soldiers wouldn't have committed the massacre. But without individual soldiers willing to pull triggers, ideology alone wouldn't have killed anyone. Understanding this dual causation, systematic and individual, is crucial for understanding not just Malmedy but war crimes generally. May 24th, 1945. Rosenheim, Germany. American soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division surround a farmhouse where German intelligence has indicated SS officers might be hiding. The war in Europe ended 15 days ago with Germany's unconditional surrender, but not all German soldiers have turned themselves in. Some are attempting to disappear, discarding uniforms, burning identification papers, hoping to blend into the civilian population. The Americans at this farmhouse have good intelligence. Inside are senior officers from 1st SS Panzer Division, including the unit's former commander, the Americans call for surrender. The door opens. Out walks SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, still in uniform, hands raised. The hunt for those responsible for Malmedy has just taken its most important step forward. Peiper's capture is almost anticlimactic. He hasn't been hiding. He surrendered his entire unit to American forces intact, maintained military discipline even in defeat, and continued acting as commanding officer of troops that no longer have anything to command. When questioned, he's forthright about his identity and position. This isn't bravado, it's calculation. Peiper understands that Germany has lost, that the Nazi regime is finished, and that his best chance for survival is cooperation. He assumes, probably correctly, that the Americans will need German officers to help maintain order in occupied Germany. What he doesn't yet fully understand is that the Americans are interested in him for reasons beyond his administrative utility. They're building war crimes cases, and Peiper's name is at the top of several lists. The investigation of Malmedy and related atrocities is already well underway by the time Peiper is captured. Lieutenant Colonel Burton Ellis, assigned to lead the American war crimes investigation, has spent months assembling evidence. He has sworn statements from 43 American survivors describing the massacre in detail. He has forensic evidence from the field at Baugnez, photographs of frozen corpses, spent shell casings, ballistic reports. He has Belgian civilian testimony about other atrocities committed by Kampfgruppe Peiper. What he needs now are the perpetrators. And thanks to the nature of the surrender, he has them in quantity. Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe surrendered as a unit. Most of the men who participated in the Malmedy massacre are already in American custody. The challenge Ellis faces is connecting individual German soldiers to specific crimes. The massacre at Malmedy involved approximately 200 SS troops from Peiper's column. Some were direct participants who fired weapons into the crowd of prisoners. Others were witnesses who stood by while the shooting occurred. Still others may have been nearby but not directly involved. German military records help identify which units were at Baugnez on December 17th, but determining which individual soldiers pulled which triggers requires painstaking cross-referencing of testimony, unit rosters, and interrogation results. This will take months. The investigation expands beyond just Malmedy to encompass all atrocities committed by Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Ardennes offensive. Ellis's team documents the murders at Honsfeld, Bühlingen, Ligneuville, Stavelot, and Chenot. Each crime scene is investigated separately. Each victim is identified where possible. Each witness is interviewed. The team eventually compiles over 300 witness statements, American soldiers, Belgian civilians, German prisoners who are willing to testify against their former comrades. The evidence file grows to hundreds of pages. This is becoming the most extensively documented war crimes investigation in the European theatre. The interrogation of German prisoners produces varying levels of cooperation. Some SS soldiers, particularly younger ones who were conscripted late in the war, are willing to talk. They describe what they saw, identify who gave orders, explain the command structure. Others, particularly career SS officers, refuse to cooperate. They claim they weren't at specific locations, don't remember details, or simply invoke their right to silence. Peiper himself is cooperative about military matters but carefully vague about atrocities. Yes, his unit was at Malmedy. No, he wasn't personally present at the Crossroads. No, he didn't order any prisoners killed. He knew nothing about any massacre until after it occurred. He's lying, but proving it will be difficult. The breakthrough comes from lower-ranking SS soldiers hoping to avoid prosecution by implicating superiors. Several enlisted men describe receiving orders from officers about not taking prisoners. Some describe watching officers shoot American prisoners. One particularly detailed account comes from an SS trooper who describes being ordered to join a firing squad at Malmedy. He claims he fired over the heads of American prisoners rather than into them, but his testimony confirms that the massacre was organized, not spontaneous. This testimony, combined with survivor accounts and forensic evidence, allows investigators to identify specific German soldiers who were present and participated. By August 1945, Ellis has identified 358 former members of Kampfgruppe Peiper who potentially participated in war crimes during the Ardennes offensive. Of these, 74 are still in custody and can be formally charged. The others are dead killed in the final months of the war or have escaped, disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. Among those who can be charged, the evidence varies in quality. For some, there's direct testimony from survivors or witnesses, identifying them by name as shooters. For others, the evidence is circumstantial. They were members of units present at massacre sites, but their specific actions can't be definitively proven. The legal theory underlying the charges involves both direct participation and command responsibility. Individual soldiers who fired weapons at prisoners are charged with murder. Officers who ordered the killings or created command climates that enabled them are charged with war crimes based on command responsibility. Peiper falls into the latter category. The prosecution doesn't claim he personally shot anyone at Malmedy. The evidence shows he wasn't there, but they argue he's responsible because his orders, his command climate, and his failure to prevent or punish the killings make him legally culpable for crimes committed by his subordinates. The political dimension of the investigation creates complications. By late 1945, relationships between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union are deteriorating. The Cold War is beginning. Some American policymakers argue that prosecuting German officers who fought against the Soviets might be strategically unwise, that Germany needs to be rebuilt as a bulwark against communism, that focusing on Nazi war crimes risks alienating the German population that America now needs as allies. These arguments don't stop the Malmedy prosecution, but they create an atmosphere where aggressive pursuit of war crimes is increasingly questioned. The preparation for trial requires assembling all evidence in one location and organizing it for presentation. The prosecution team moves to Dachau, the former concentration camp that the Americans have repurposed as a war crimes trial venue. The symbolism is intentional. Trying SS officers at a concentration camp sends a message about what they represented and what they enabled. By early 1946, the trial preparation is complete. 73 defendants are formally charged with violating the laws of war by murdering American prisoners at Malmedy and Belgian civilians at other locations. The trial is scheduled to begin in May. The hunt is over. Now comes the harder part, proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt and convincing the world that justice has been served. October 20th, 1945. Schwäbisch Hall Prison, Germany. SS Private Georg Fleps sits alone in a cold cell, trying to stay awake. He's been awake for 60 hours straight. Every time he starts to doze, guards wake him, bang on the cell door, shout at him. Sometimes they come in and force him to stand. The American interrogators have told him this will continue until he confesses to what happened at Malmedy. Fleps was there. He saw the massacre. He may have participated. The Americans want names, details, orders. They want him to implicate his superiors, particularly Joachim Peiper. Fleps has been resisting, but his resistance is crumbling. Sleep deprivation, cold, isolation, and psychological pressure are breaking him down. In 6 more hours, he'll confess to anything they want. The interrogation methods used by American investigators to extract confessions from SS defendants represent one of the Malmedy case's most controversial aspects. Lieutenant William Pearl, the chief interrogator, employs techniques that range from aggressive questioning to what can only be called torture. Prisoners are kept in solitary confinement for weeks. They're subjected to extended interrogations lasting 12 to 16 hours without breaks. Sleep deprivation is systematic. Guards wake prisoners every hour throughout the night. Mock trials are conducted where prisoners are convicted and told they'll be executed. Some prisoners are hooded and made to wear signs saying, "I'm a murderer." Physical beatings occur, though Pearl later denies authorizing them. The rationale for these methods is rooted in frustration. The investigators know the massacre occurred. They have survivor testimony and forensic evidence. What they need is German confirmation, ideally from participants willing to describe the chain of command and identify who gave orders. But many SS prisoners refuse to cooperate. They maintain silence, claim not to remember, or give stories that contradict known facts. The interrogators believe they're dealing with hardened war criminals who are lying to avoid justice. Breaking these prisoners psychologically seems necessary to get truth. This logic would later be challenged in court, but in October 1945, it guides interrogation practices. The specific techniques used violate both the Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war and American military regulations about interrogation. Prisoners are entitled to humane treatment, adequate food, sleep, and protection from physical abuse. The interrogations at Schwäbisch Hall violate all these standards. But the violations are systematic, not the work of rogue interrogators. Pearl operates with knowledge and implicit approval of superiors who want confessions and aren't asking too many questions about methods. The command climate that enables torture at Schwäbisch Hall parallels the command climate that enabled Massacre at Malmedy in both cases. The pressure to achieve results overrides legal and moral constraints. The confessions obtained through these methods are legally problematic but often factually accurate. Georg Fleps, after 6 more hours of sleep deprivation, confesses that Peiper personally ordered the killing of prisoners at Malmedy. This is almost certainly false. Peiper wasn't at the Crossroads when the shooting occurred, but Fleps, broken by exhaustion and fear, signs a statement saying whatever his interrogators want to hear. Other prisoners confess to direct participation in the shootings. Some of these confessions are probably true, the prisoners actually did participate, but determining which confessions are reliable and which are products of torture becomes impossible. Torture doesn't just violate ethics. It produces unreliable intelligence. The physical evidence of torture emerges slowly. Father Paul Rosenfeld, a Catholic chaplain assigned to minister to the prisoners, becomes suspicious about the interrogation methods. He visits prisoners in their cells and hears consistent stories about beatings, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture. Some prisoners show him bruises, others describe mock executions that left them psychologically shattered. Rosenfeld begins documenting these allegations secretly, taking notes that he smuggles out of the prison. He eventually brings his concerns to senior officers, who are skeptical but agree to investigate. The investigation into interrogation methods is cursory and inconclusive. Pearl denies authorizing torture and claims any physical abuse was unauthorized action by individual guards. The prisoners making allegations are war criminals who have every reason to lie to discredit the prosecution. Without independent verification, it's impossible to determine truth. The investigation essentially concludes that while interrogation methods may have been aggressive, they were within acceptable bounds given the seriousness of the crimes being investigated. This conclusion satisfies no one. The prisoners and their German defense attorneys know it's whitewash. The American prosecutors worry, correctly, that these allegations will undermine their case at trial. The defense strategy becomes obvious: attack the interrogation methods to invalidate the confessions. Defense attorney Colonel Willis Everett, assigned to represent the German defendants, understands that the massacre itself is nearly impossible to deny. Too many American survivors saw it happen. Forensic evidence confirms systematic execution. Trying to prove innocence is hopeless. But proving the confessions were coerced might get the cases dismissed, or at least create reasonable doubt. Everett begins gathering evidence from prisoners about torture, preparing to turn the war crimes trial into a trial of American interrogation practices. The moral implications are profound and uncomfortable. American prosecutors are preparing to try SS officers for war crimes while employing interrogation methods that themselves violate international law. The SS murdered prisoners at Malmedy. American interrogators tortured prisoners at Schwäbisch Hall. The scale and intent are vastly different. No one died from interrogation, and the goal was obtaining evidence rather than mass murder. But the principle is similar. Both involve violating the laws of war, because following those laws seems inconvenient or impossible. The Americans are prosecuting Germans for taking shortcuts with the Geneva Convention while taking their own shortcuts with the same document. The confessions remain in the evidence file despite torture allegations. The prosecution argues that even if interrogation methods were harsh, the confessions corroborate survivor testimony and forensic evidence that independently prove the massacre occurred. The specific details in the confessions, locations, times, weapons used, match what American investigators already know from other sources. This suggests the confessions, though coerced, contain truth. But this argument creates a dangerous precedent that torture is acceptable if it produces accurate information. This is the logic that will haunt American interrogation practices through subsequent wars, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. By early 1946, both prosecution and defense understand the trial will hinge partly on the torture allegations. The prosecution needs the confessions to establish command responsibility and identify specific perpetrators. The defense needs to discredit those confessions to create reasonable doubt. The judges will have to decide whether confessions obtained through torture are admissible evidence, and the American military will have to confront the uncomfortable reality that pursuing justice for Malmedy required committing injustices of its own. The moral clarity of prosecuting Nazi war criminals has become muddied by the methods used to build the case. Justice pursued through torture is still justice, but it's justice compromised, tainted by the same disregard for law that it claims to punish. May 16, 1946, Dachau, Germany. The former concentration camp's administrative building has been converted into a courtroom. Wooden benches fill what was once a processing centre, where tens of thousands of prisoners were catalogued before being sent to their deaths. Now 73 men in civilian clothes sit in the defendant's dock, guarded by American military police. They are former members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, charged with violating the laws of war. At the front of the courtroom sits Joachim Peiper, no longer wearing his SS uniform with its Knight's Cross and decorations, dressed instead in a plain suit that makes him look like a businessman on trial for fraud rather than a war criminal facing execution. The symbolism of the location is not lost on anyone. These men who served the Nazi regime are being tried in a building that exemplifies what that regime created. The prosecution's opening statement is delivered by Colonel Burton Ellis, who has spent 6 months preparing this case. He speaks for 2 hours, laying out the evidence methodically. On December 17, 1944, approximately 130 American soldiers surrendered to German forces at the Baugnez Crossroads near Malmedy, Belgium. These prisoners were disarmed, searched, robbed of personal items, and herded into a field. They were then systematically murdered by machine gun fire and close-range pistol shots. 84 bodies were later recovered, many showing evidence of execution-style head wounds. 43 men survived by playing dead or escaping. Ellis introduces the concept of command responsibility, that officers who create climates enabling war crimes bear legal culpability even if they don't personally pull triggers. The survivor testimony begins on the second day and continues for 2 weeks. Homer Ford takes the stand first, describing his experience in careful, controlled language that occasionally breaks into raw emotion. He recounts the convoy, the surrender, the waiting in the field, then the sudden eruption of gunfire. He describes lying motionless while Germans walked among the bodies, shooting survivors. He identifies several defendants as members of the unit that captured and murdered his comrades. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys challenge his ability to identify specific Germans. It was chaos. He was terrified. How can he be certain? Ford's answer is simple. I'll never forget their faces as long as I live. These are the men who killed my friends. Virgil Larry's testimony is particularly powerful because he's both survivor and investigator. He describes the massacre from his position, lying beneath a corpse, watching Germans systematically execute the wounded. Then he describes returning to the field 5 weeks later as part of the investigation team, seeing the frozen bodies of men he knew, helping document the crime scene. The prosecution uses Larry to connect survivor accounts with forensic evidence. He can point to photographs of the field and say, I was lying here, the machine guns were positioned there, I watched Germans walk through this area, shooting people. His testimony transforms abstract evidence into human narrative. The forensic evidence is presented through expert witnesses, medical examiners who performed autopsies on the frozen corpses, ballistics experts who analysed shell casings and bullet wounds, military photographers who documented the scene. The evidence is overwhelming. 70% of victims showed signs of close-range head wounds delivered after they were already down. The shell casing distribution pattern proves machine guns fired from fixed positions into a standing group. The absence of return fire or American weapons at the scene confirms the victims were disarmed prisoners. Defense attorneys don't challenge this evidence, they can't. Instead, they argue their clients weren't present or didn't participate directly. The photographs are the prosecution's most powerful and disturbing exhibits. Enlarged to poster size and mounted on easels, they show exactly what German soldiers did at Baugnez. Bodies frozen in contorted positions, exit wounds clearly visible on heads, clusters of corpses showing where men fell together. The courtroom falls silent when these photographs are displayed. Some defendants look away, others stare impassively. Peiper maintains the same calm demeanour he's shown throughout the trial, occasionally taking notes but showing no visible emotion. The photographs force everyone to confront the physical reality of the crime. These aren't abstract legal concepts, but actual human beings who died terrified and helpless. Belgian civilian testimony expands the case beyond Malmedy to demonstrate a pattern of atrocities. Survivors from Stavelot describe SS troops burning houses with families inside, shooting civilians who fled the flames. Witnesses from Ligneville describe executions in the Hotel du Moulin. The prosecution's strategy is to show that Malmedy wasn't an isolated incident, but part of systematic behaviour by Kampfgruppe Peiper throughout their advance. This pattern evidence supports the command responsibility theory. It's implausible that Peiper knew nothing about multiple massacres committed by his own unit over 8 days. Either he ordered them, or he created a climate where subordinates understood such actions were acceptable. The defence strategy led by Colonel Willis Everett is multifaceted. For some defendants, Everett argues they weren't at Malmedy, misidentification, confusion, wrong place. For others, he argues they were present but didn't fire weapons. They were drivers, mechanics, communications, specialists, not shooters. For Peiper specifically, Everett argues he wasn't at the Crossroads when the shooting occurred. He didn't order the massacre, and he couldn't be held responsible for spontaneous actions by subordinates operating beyond his direct control. But Everett's main strategy is attacking the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions. The torture allegations create courtroom drama that threatens to derail the entire trial. Everett calls defendant after defendant to the stand to describe their treatment at Schwäbisch Hall prison. They testify about sleep deprivation lasting days, beatings administered by guards, mock trials where they were sentenced to death, psychological torture designed to break their resistance. Several defendants show scars they claim came from beatings. The testimony is consistent and detailed. Everett produces Father Rosenfeld's documentation supporting these allegations. He argues that confessions obtained through torture are legally inadmissible and morally unconscionable. How can America prosecute war crimes while committing its own violations of international law? The prosecution's response is defensive and unsatisfying. Lieutenant William Pearl takes the stand to deny authorizing torture. He admits interrogations were aggressive and that psychological pressure was used, but he insists any physical abuse was unauthorized and committed by individual guards acting without his knowledge. The prosecution argues that even if interrogation methods were harsh, the confessions corroborate independent evidence, survivor testimony, forensic analysis, Belgian witness accounts. The truth of what happened at Malmedy isn't dependent on the confessions. They merely confirm what other evidence already proves. This argument is legally sound but morally weak. It essentially concedes that torture occurred while arguing it doesn't matter because the defendants are guilty anyway. The judges, a panel of American military officers with no prior judicial experience, face an impossible decision about admissibility. Excluding the confessions might undermine command responsibility charges, making it harder to convict officers like Peiper who weren't physically present at massacre sites. But admitting confessions obtained through torture validates methods that violate the same international law the trial is meant to uphold. The judges split the difference. They admit the confessions, but instruct themselves to consider torture allegations when weighing their credibility. This satisfies no one. The prosecution worries confessions will be discounted. The defense argues torture-tainted evidence should be completely excluded. Peiper's own testimony is the trial's most anticipated moment. He takes the stand in late June, nearly 6 weeks into proceedings. He's articulate, confident, and completely unrepentant about serving the SS. He describes his military service with pride, combat on multiple fronts, decorations for bravery, leadership of elite troops. He admits his unit was at Malmedy, but insists he was kilometers ahead of the Crossroads dealing with American resistance when the massacre occurred. He claims the first time he heard about prisoner killings was days later, when rumors reached him. He insists he never ordered prisoners executed, and in fact ordered his officers to treat prisoners according to military regulations. Under cross-examination, prosecutors confront him with the trail of atrocities his unit committed. How could he not know? His answer is practiced. Combat is chaotic. His unit covered 30 miles in 8 days. He couldn't personally supervise every action. The prosecution's closing argument emphasizes command responsibility. Even if Peiper didn't personally shoot anyone, even if he wasn't physically present at each massacre, he commanded the unit that committed these crimes. His orders emphasized speed above all else. His Eastern Front experience taught him that killing prisoners was acceptable. His failure to prevent, stop, or punish the massacres makes him responsible. Colonel Ellis quotes from military law. A commander is responsible for the war crimes committed by his subordinates when those crimes result from his orders, his knowledge and consent, or his failure to prevent or punish them. Under this standard, Peiper is guilty. The defense closing argument attacks this theory as retroactive justice, applying legal standards that didn't clearly exist during the war. Everett argues that soldiers, following orders in combat, shouldn't be tried as criminals for actions their commanders authorized. He emphasizes the torture used to obtain confessions, arguing the entire case is tainted by American misconduct. He appeals to the judge's sense of military brotherhood. These defendants are soldiers who fought bravely, who lost the war and now face victor's justice, who are being scapegoated for systemic failures of German leadership. It's a calculated strategy that separates individual defendants from Nazi ideology, portraying them as professionals caught in circumstances beyond their control. The deliberations take 16 days. The judges review thousands of pages of testimony, examine hundreds of exhibits, debate command responsibility, doctrine, and evidence admissibility. On July 16, 1946, they reach verdicts. All 73 defendants are found guilty. The courtroom erupts, German defendants shouting, families crying, American observers grimly satisfied. But the verdicts, while unanimous on guilt, leave the question of punishment for separate determination. That decision, announced days later, will prove even more controversial than the trial itself. The question is no longer whether the defendants committed war crimes. The question is what justice for those crimes should look like. July 16, 1946, 2:15 p.m. The judges return to the courtroom after 16 days of deliberation. The defendants stand, knowing their fate is about to be announced. The presiding judge reads the verdicts methodically. The court finds all defendants guilty of violating the laws of war. A pause as the courtroom absorbs this. Then the sentencing: Joachim Peiper, death by hanging; Werner Pötschke, death by hanging. The judge continues down the list. 43 death sentences in total, more than half the defendants, 22 life sentences, 8 sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. Not a single acquittal. The Malmedy trial has produced the harshest penalties of any American war crimes proceeding in the European theatre. The German defendants stand silent, faces pale. Their attorneys immediately announce intention to appeal. In the gallery, American survivors watch with mixed emotions, satisfaction that justice has been done, but also uncertainty whether hanging men years after the crime truly resolves anything. The death sentences create immediate controversy that extends far beyond the courtroom. 43 men condemned to hang represents an execution on a scale that makes even some prosecution supporters uncomfortable. The death penalty for war crimes is legally justified. The Geneva Convention explicitly allows execution of soldiers who violate the laws of war. But 43 executions, carried out publicly, risks creating martyrs and inflaming German public opinion at a time when American policy is shifting toward rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Political considerations that seemed irrelevant during the trial suddenly become paramount during sentencing review. The condemned men are transferred to Landsberg prison, the same facility where Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf while imprisoned after his failed putsch in 1923. The symbolism is again intentional. These SS officers will await execution in the birthplace of Nazi ideology. The death row cells are small, austere, designed for solitary confinement. The men are allowed writing materials, chaplain visits, and limited family contact. Some write memoirs protesting their innocence. Others write letters to families, preparing them for the inevitable. A few make peace with their fate. Peiper himself maintains the same calm demeanour that characterised his trial testimony, writing to his wife that he served Germany honourably and has nothing for which to apologise. The first execution date is set for October 15th, 1946, just 3 months after sentencing. But the executions don't occur. Appeals are filed, arguing that the torture-tainted confessions invalidate the convictions, that command responsibility doctrine wasn't clearly established, law at the time of the crimes, that executing soldiers for following orders sets dangerous precedents. These appeals are officially rejected, but they create delays. More significantly, the geopolitical situation is changing. By late 1946, the Soviet Union's intentions in Eastern Europe are clear. The wartime alliance is fracturing. American policymakers are rethinking whether executing German officers serves American strategic interests. German public opinion mobilizes against the sentences with surprising effectiveness. The Catholic Church in Germany, which remained largely silent during Nazi atrocities, becomes vocal about the Malmedy defendants' fate. German newspapers operating under American occupation but with increasing freedom, publish editorials, questioning American motives. The argument is consistent. American interrogators used torture to obtain confessions, then condemned men based on tainted evidence. This isn't justice, it's Victor's revenge. The fact that the massacre definitely occurred, that the forensic evidence is overwhelming, that survivor testimony is compelling, these facts get lost in focus on interrogation abuses. International pressure compounds domestic German opposition. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which inspected Schwäbisch Hall prison files, reports confirming that interrogation methods violated Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war. The emerging West German government, which the Americans are helping establish as a democratic state, quietly communicates that executing the Malmedy defendants would undermine efforts to build pro-American sentiment in Germany. British officials, concerned about precedents for their own war crimes, prosecutions, express reservations about command responsibility doctrine. The political pressure becomes intense. The most effective opposition comes from an unexpected source, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. In 1949, McCarthy launches a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee investigation into the Malmedy trial, focusing exclusively on torture allegations. McCarthy's motives are complex, partly genuine concern about American conduct, partly political opportunism, partly positioning himself for the anti-communist crusade that will define his career. But regardless of motivation, his investigation is thorough and damaging. He calls American interrogators to testify under oath about their methods. He presents medical evidence of beatings. He questions whether America can claim moral authority while using Gestapo-style interrogation techniques. The McCarthy hearings create a public relations disaster for the Malmedy prosecution. Defense attorney Willis Everett testifies extensively, describing in graphic detail the torture his clients endured. Former prisoners demonstrate stress positions they were forced to maintain for hours. Photographs of bruises and scars are entered into evidence. The American public, which supported harsh treatment of Nazi war criminals immediately after the war, is increasingly uncomfortable with torture, regardless of who the victims are. Opinion polls from 1949 show a significant shift. While 78% of Americans supported executing the Malmedy defendants in 1946, by 1949, only 52% still favor execution, with growing support for commutation. The legal reviews continue throughout 1948 and 1949. Multiple boards examine the trial record, the evidence, and the torture allegations. The conclusions are nuanced. The massacre definitely occurred. The defendants were definitely involved. But the interrogation methods were definitely improper. This creates an impossible situation. The crimes warrant severe punishment, but the investigation methods undermine confidence in the convictions. The reviewers recommend commuting the death sentences to life imprisonment, not because the defendants are innocent, but because the process was flawed. Justice compromised by torture is still justice, but it's not justice the American military wants to defend publicly. By January 1951, the first review board formally recommends commuting all death sentences to life imprisonment or time served. The recommendation acknowledges that the Malmedy massacre was a genuine atrocity committed by SS troops who deserved punishment, but it concludes that the torture-tainted investigation and the questionable application of command responsibility doctrine make execution inappropriate. The recommendation is forwarded to the Army Secretary for final decision. The legal question has become political. What serves American interests? Better executing war criminals to demonstrate that atrocities have consequences, or commuting sentences to demonstrate that America respects due process, even for enemies? The American survivors of Malmedy watched these developments with growing anger and betrayal. They testified at trial, reliving trauma to ensure justice. They saw the photographs of their dead friends, the forensic evidence proving systematic murder. Now they're watching the perpetrators potentially escape execution through legal technicalities about interrogation methods. Homer Ford writes to his congressman, "They killed my buddies in cold blood with their hands up. Now we're worried about whether they were asked questions too harshly. Where's the justice for the men who died in that field?" His frustration represents a broader tension. Survivors want punishment for war crimes, but they want it achieved through methods that uphold the principles Americans claim to defend. The commutation process drags through 1951. Some death sentences are reduced to life imprisonment, others are reduced to time served, meaning immediate release. The decisions seem arbitrary. Some defendants who were minor participants, remain in prison, while others who held command positions are freed. The rationale is opaque. By 1952, it's clear that none of the Malmedy defendants will actually be executed. The death sentences that seemed inevitable in July 1946 have become politically impossible by the early 1950s. The Cold War has created new priorities. Former SS officers who fought against the Soviets are now potentially useful allies. Justice for American soldiers murdered in 1944 cannot compete with strategic necessities of 1952. The final chapter in the sentencing saga comes on December 22nd, 1956, when Joachim Peiper walks out of Landsberg prison a free man. He served 11 years and 6 months, less than 2 months for each of the 84 Americans his unit murdered at Malmedy. He's released under the same program that frees most other Malmedy defendants time served for good behaviour, sentences commuted repeatedly until imprisonment becomes time served. He's 41 years old, unrepentant, and about to discover that freedom doesn't mean forgiveness. The legal case is over. The moral case will follow him for the rest of his life. March 7th, 1949. Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. Senator Joseph McCarthy stands before a packed hearing room, holding a thick folder of documents. He's about to begin the Armed Services Subcommittee investigation that will systematically dismantle the Malmedy prosecution's credibility. McCarthy is not interested in whether the massacre occurred, that's not in dispute. He's interested in how American interrogators extracted confessions and whether those methods represent a betrayal of American values. For the next 6 months, these hearings will put American conduct on trial more effectively than the Dachau proceedings put German conduct on trial. The man who prosecuted Nazi war crimes using torture will become the story, overshadowing the war criminals themselves. The hearings begin with testimony from former defendants describing their treatment at Schwäbisch Hall prison. The testimony is graphic and consistent. Sleep deprivation for 72 consecutive hours, beatings with rubber hoses that leave no visible marks, mock executions where prisoners are hooded, told they're about to die, and subjected to sounds of others supposedly being shot, solitary confinement in cells kept deliberately cold, stress positions maintained until muscles fail. The testimony is damning not just because of what was done, but because of how systematically it was applied. This wasn't rogue guards committing isolated abuses. This was a program designed and implemented by American officers to break prisoner resistance. Lieutenant William Pearl, the chief interrogator, takes the stand to defend his methods. His testimony is defensive and ultimately unconvincing. He admits to aggressive questioning but denies authorizing physical abuse. He claims sleep deprivation was minimal, stress positions were brief, mock trials were psychological pressure but not torture. His semantic distinctions between aggressive interrogation and torture, between discomfort and abuse, satisfy no one. Under cross-examination, Pearl struggles to explain why so many prisoners have consistent stories about beatings if he didn't authorize them. His final position is that he did what was necessary to obtain evidence against war criminals, and he'd do it again. Defense attorney Colonel Willis Everett emerges as the hearing's moral center. He testifies passionately about his obligation to defend his clients vigorously, even though they were Nazi war criminals, even though the massacre definitely occurred. He argues that American legitimacy depends on upholding legal principles, even for the worst enemies. If America tortures confessions from SS officers, how is America different from the Gestapo it claims to oppose? Everett's testimony is powerful because he's not claiming his clients are innocent. He's claiming they deserve fair trials, and torture makes fair trials impossible. This argument resonates with senators and the public in ways that technical legal arguments never could. Medical evidence presented during the hearings corroborates torture allegations. Several defendants submit to physical examinations by independent physicians who document scars, healed fractures, and other injuries consistent with beatings. Some injuries are clearly recent inflicted during the 1945 to 1946 interrogation period. The medical reports are entered as exhibits, providing objective evidence beyond prisoner testimony. The doctors cannot definitively prove the injuries came from interrogation rather than combat, but the timing and location of injuries match prisoner accounts. This evidence forces even skeptical senators to acknowledge that something improper occurred. The question of how widespread the torture was becomes central. Were these isolated incidents affecting a few prisoners, or systematic abuse affecting most defendants? The statistical evidence is revealing. Of the 73 defendants tried at Dachau, 68 claimed they were tortured 92%. The consistency of this percentage across defendants interrogated at different times by different interrogators suggests systematic practice rather than isolated abuse. Some defendants who confessed later recanted, claiming their confessions were products of torture. The most damaging recantation comes from Georg Fleps, who confessed that Peiper personally ordered the Malmedy massacre, a confession he now says was complete fabrication extracted through days of sleep deprivation. The hearings reveal a command climate problem similar to what enabled the Malmedy massacre itself. Just as Peiper's emphasis on speed created an atmosphere where subordinates understood killing prisoners was acceptable, the American investigation's emphasis on obtaining confessions created an atmosphere where interrogators understood torture was acceptable. No one explicitly ordered torture, but supervisors made clear that results mattered more than methods. Interrogators who produced confessions were praised. Those who adhered strictly to Geneva Convention protocols while obtaining less useful information were seen as insufficiently committed. The parallel is uncomfortable. Both German combat operations and American interrogations were corrupted by command climates that valued outcomes over legal compliance. The impact on public opinion is significant and swift. In 1946, immediately after the trial, 78% of Americans polled supported executing the Malmedy defendants. By 1950, after 2 years of publicity about torture allegations, only 48% still support execution. The shift isn't driven by sympathy for SS war criminals. The percentage of Americans who believe the massacre occurred and that perpetrators deserve punishment remains stable. What's changed is confidence that the convictions were obtained fairly. Torture has tainted the entire proceeding. The question is no longer whether the defendants are guilty, but whether America conducted itself honorably in proving that guilt. The legal implications extend beyond Malmedy to all war crimes, prosecutions. If torture invalidates the Malmedy convictions, does it invalidate other cases where similar interrogation methods were used? The Army conducts a broader review of war crimes investigations and discovers that aggressive interrogation techniques were common across multiple cases. Sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and physical coercion were used to extract confessions from defendants accused of concentration camp atrocities, prisoner abuse, and civilian massacres. The Malmedy case threatens to become precedent that undermines dozens of convictions. This prospect forces reconsideration of sentencing across the board. By 1951, the Sentence Review Board formally recommends commuting all Malmedy death sentences. The board's report acknowledges the massacre occurred and the defendants participated, but concludes the investigation methods were so improper that capital punishment is unjustifiable. The report uses carefully calibrated language. While the evidence supports the conclusion that war crimes were committed, the methods by which some of that evidence was obtained raise serious questions about due process. This is bureaucratic language for a damning conclusion. America compromised its principles while prosecuting German violations of the same principles. The releases begin in 1951 and continue through 1956. Some defendants are released immediately when sentences are commuted to time served. Others remain imprisoned with sentences reduced to specific terms: 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Peiper's death sentence is commuted first to life imprisonment, then to 35 years, then to time served. The progression shows the erosion of political will to keep Malmedy defendants imprisoned. Each commutation creates pressure to commute the rest. By 1955, nearly all defendants are free. By 1956, the last prisoner walks out. The massacre occurred in 1944. The trials concluded in 1946. By 1956, every perpetrator is free. The total time served averages approximately 10 years. The reaction from American survivors is bitter fury. They watch men who murdered their friends walk free while official justifications focus on American interrogation failures rather than German war crimes. Homer Ford, who testified at trial and cooperated fully with investigators, writes angry letters to newspapers and congressmen. "We did everything the Army asked. We testified. We relived the worst day of our lives. And for what? So the killers could go home after 10 years? Where's the justice?" His rage is widely shared among survivors, who feel betrayed by a legal system that seemed more concerned with protecting perpetrators' rights than delivering justice for victims. The lasting damage to the Malmedy prosecution's legitimacy is severe. The torture allegations don't disprove that the massacre occurred. The forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and Belgian witness accounts establish that, beyond doubt, but they create a narrative where American misconduct becomes the story rather than German atrocity. This narrative serves multiple purposes. For Germans seeking to rehabilitate the SS, it provides moral equivalence. America tortured too, so who are they to judge? For Americans uncomfortable with the Cold War alliance with former enemies, it provides justification. We can work with these men because their prosecutions were flawed anyway. For historians seeking truth, it provides confusion separating what actually happened from what torture-coerced confessions claimed happened. The question that emerges from the hearings and commutations is whether justice was achieved at all. The massacre definitely occurred, the evidence proves it, but the investigation was compromised by torture. The trials were tainted by coerced confessions. The sentences were ultimately not carried out. So what was accomplished? Some argue that even flawed justice is better than no justice, that the trial at least established an historical record and brought some accountability. Others argue that justice achieved through torture isn't justice at all, that America diminished itself by using the same methods it condemned in others. Both perspectives have merit. The uncomfortable truth is that the Malmedy prosecution succeeded in proving war crimes occurred, but failed to demonstrate that America could punish those crimes while maintaining its own principles. July 14th, 1976, 3 a.m., Treves, France. Joachim Peiper wakes to the sound of breaking glass. He's lived in this isolated house in rural eastern France for 4 years, translating military histories, living quietly, trying to avoid attention, but someone has found him. He moves to his desk, opens a drawer, removes a pistol. Outside, he can hear movement, multiple people surrounding the house. Then the smell of gasoline, then flames. The house is burning. Peiper has perhaps 60 seconds to make a decision. Try to escape through the flames and risk being shot, or stay inside and die. He places the pistol barrel against his chest and fires. The fire consumes the house. By dawn, French police will find his charred body. Whether he died by his own hand or was murdered remains disputed. What's certain is that Peiper, who escaped legal execution, did not escape justice. The years between Peiper's release in 1956 and his death 20 years later demonstrate that freedom is not the same as peace. He attempts to build a normal life but finds that his past follows him everywhere. His first job after prison is with Porsche in Stuttgart, working in vehicle testing. He's hired under his real name, he's not hiding his identity. But when Porsche employees discover they're working alongside the commander responsible for Malmedy, protests begin. Workers refuse to collaborate with him, some threaten to strike. Porsche's management, concerned about public relations, asks Peiper to resign. He does, quietly, without complaint. His second attempt at employment ends similarly. Volkswagen hires him in 1960 as a technical translator, utilizing his fluency in English and French. For several months, he works anonymously in a large office where no one knows his background. Then someone recognizes his name from war crimes, trial, publicity. Word spreads. The company receives letters from veterans organizations demanding his firing. German newspapers run stories. War criminal working for VW. The pressure becomes untenable. Volkswagen offers him severance to leave voluntarily. Again, he complies. By 1961, it's clear that traditional employment is impossible. His past disqualifies him from normal life. Peiper turns to freelance work that doesn't require employer approval, translating military books and historical documents. He's fluent in 4 languages and has extensive military expertise. Publishers don't care about his past as long as his translations are accurate. This work provides income, but not community. He lives alone, estranged from his wife and children, who cannot escape association with his crimes. He corresponds with former SS comrades, a shrinking circle of men who share his past and his inability to escape it. These letters, later discovered and published, reveal a man who remains unrepentant about his military service, but increasingly bitter about his treatment. In 1972, Peiper makes a decision that seems inexplicable. He purchases a house in Treves, a tiny village in eastern France near the German border. Why would a man convicted of war crimes against French and Belgian civilians choose to live in France? The most likely explanation is that he believed enough time had passed that rural France would offer anonymity that industrial Germany couldn't. He's partially right. For 4 years, most villagers don't know who he is. He lives quietly, keeps to himself, walks his dog, translates books. To neighbours who do learn his identity, He presents himself as a soldier who followed orders, who regrets the war but not his service. But anonymity in the modern world is temporary. In 1976, a French communist newspaper publishes an exposé revealing that Joachim Peiper, SS war criminal responsible for Malmedy and the massacre of French civilians, is living peacefully in Travers. The article provides his address. The reaction is immediate and visceral. French veterans organizations demand his deportation. Belgian newspapers run stories. Anonymous letters arrive at his house, some threatening violence. Peiper writes to friends that he's being harassed but isn't particularly worried. He's armed, the house is isolated, and he doesn't believe anyone will actually act on threats. This is a fatal miscalculation. The night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, Bastille Day Eve, France's national holiday, someone or some group decides to act. The identity of the attackers has never been definitively established. French police investigate but find no conclusive evidence. The most likely suspects are French resistance veterans or their children, Belgian survivors of SS atrocities, or possibly Jewish Nazi hunters who had tracked Peiper for years. Whoever they were, they came prepared with gasoline and weapons. They surrounded the house, set it ablaze, and ensured Peiper couldn't escape. Whether Peiper committed suicide to avoid burning to death or was shot trying to escape remains unclear. The official police report calls it suicide. Many historians suspect murder. The question of whether Peiper's death represents justice or vigilantism depends on perspective. From one viewpoint, he escaped legal execution through technicalities and political maneuvering. He served 11 years for crimes that killed 84 Americans and over 100 Belgian civilians. Legal justice failed, so unofficial justice corrected the failure. From another viewpoint, he was murdered without trial, without due process, by unknown assailants who appointed themselves executioners. This is vengeance, not justice. Both interpretations have merit. What's undeniable is that the legal system's failure to execute Peiper created conditions where others felt compelled to act. The reaction to Peiper's death varies dramatically by audience. German newspapers that had followed his case for decades publish obituaries that portray him as a soldier caught up in larger forces, a victim of victor's justice who never fully escaped his past. French and Belgian newspapers are less sympathetic, describing him as a war criminal who evaded appropriate punishment and finally faced consequences. American veterans publications note his death with grim satisfaction, justice delayed but ultimately delivered. Survivors of Malmedy have mixed reactions. Some express satisfaction that he's dead. Others point out that his death doesn't bring back their murdered friends and provides no closure. The question of what happened to other Malmedy defendants after their release is revealing. Most disappear into quiet anonymity, taking jobs that don't attract attention, living under their real names but avoiding publicity. A few achieve modest professional success. Several write memoirs claiming innocence or justifying their actions as following orders. None express genuine remorse for the massacre. Their consistent position is that they were soldiers following orders in wartime, that the victims were casualties of war, that their prosecution was victor's justice. This unrepentance suggests that whatever the legal outcomes, the moral reckoning never occurred. The American survivors' later lives provide stark contrast. Most struggle with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many have nightmares about the massacre for decades. Some become activists, speaking at schools and veterans events about their experience, ensuring the story isn't forgotten. Others refuse to discuss it, finding the memory too painful to revisit. By the 2000s, as survivors age and die, their testimonies are preserved through oral history projects and documentary films. The last living survivor dies in 2021, 77 years after the massacre, taking with him the last eyewitness memory of that December afternoon. The establishment of memorials provides some measure of closure. In 1960, a monument is erected at the Baugnez Crossroads, listing the names of all 84 Americans murdered there. Belgian and American officials attend the dedication ceremony. Survivors return periodically to visit, sometimes with family members who need to understand what happened. The site becomes a pilgrimage destination for American veterans visiting European battlefields. Over 50,000 people visit annually, mostly Americans, drawn by the story's horror and the victims' sacrifice. The memorial ensures that the massacre remains in public memory even as those who witnessed it die. The broader question Peiper's death raises is whether war criminals can ever escape their crimes. Legal punishment ended for Peiper in 1956 when he was released from prison. But social punishment continued for 20 more years. He couldn't hold normal employment, he couldn't live openly without harassment, he couldn't escape his past. His death, whether suicide or murder, suggests that for certain crimes, legal resolution is insufficient. Society continues prosecuting even after courts finish. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether we believe in redemption, whether punishment should ever end, whether anyone who commits atrocities can be rehabilitated. The fact that Peiper showed no remorse complicates these questions. It's easier to argue for redemption when perpetrators acknowledge guilt and seek forgiveness. Peiper did neither. December 17, 2024, Baugnez, Belgium. The field where the massacre occurred is covered in snow, much as it was 80 years ago. A small group stands at the memorial, American veterans' descendants, Belgian locals who maintain the site, a few historians and students. They've come to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Malmedy massacre. None of them were alive when it happened. All the survivors are dead now, the last passing just 3 years ago. The memory is no longer living testimony but historical record. The question facing this new generation is what the massacre means now, stripped of immediate pain and filtered through 8 decades of perspective. Is it just another wartime atrocity in a war filled with them? Or does it represent something larger about war, justice, and how societies remember their darkest moments? The statistical context is important for understanding Malmedy's significance. During the Second World War, approximately 10 to 15,000 prisoners of war were executed by all combatant nations, German, Soviet, Japanese, and yes, American and British forces too. The vast majority of these executions were never documented, never investigated, never prosecuted. Prisoners shot in the confusion of combat, wounded left to die, surrenders refused in the heat of battle. Malmedy is unusual not because prisoner execution occurred, but because it was so thoroughly documented. 43 survivors who could testify, photographs of bodies frozen in situ, forensic evidence preserved by winter weather. This documentation transformed Malmedy from a battlefield atrocity into a legal case. The comparison with other Second World War atrocities illuminates what made Malmedy symbolically powerful for Americans. The Germans committed far worse massacres. The entire Holocaust represents systematic atrocity on a scale that dwarfs any individual battlefield incident. The Japanese murdered tens of thousands of prisoners and civilians in China and Southeast Asia. The Soviets executed Polish officers at Katyn, murdered German prisoners by the thousands. But for Americans, Malmedy had unique power because the victims were American soldiers, because they surrendered in good faith expecting Geneva Convention protection, because the massacre was so clearly premeditated. It was a violation of the rules that Americans believed still governed warfare. The trial and its aftermath represent a separate story about the challenges of prosecuting war crimes. The Malmedy trial established important legal precedents about command responsibility, that commanders can be held accountable for crimes committed by subordinates if they created climates that enabled those crimes. This doctrine, refined at Nuremberg and in subsequent war crimes tribunals, remains central to international law. But Malmedy also demonstrated the dangers of compromising investigative integrity. The torture used to extract confessions didn't disprove the massacre occurred, but it undermined confidence in American justice and allowed perpetrators to portray themselves as victims. The educational legacy of Malmedy extends into modern military training. The massacre is taught at American service academies and in military ethics courses as a case study in both war crimes and investigation failures. Cadets learn what happened at Baugnez as an example of how command climate shapes subordinate behavior, how pressure to achieve objectives can override moral constraints, how atrocities begin with small compromises. They also learn about the torture allegations and Schwäbisch Hall interrogations as cautionary tales about how investigative misconduct can undermine legitimate prosecutions. The case appears in curricula alongside Abu Ghraib and My Lai, part of a broader examination of how American forces have sometimes failed to live up to stated principles. The cultural impact appears in unexpected places. Malmedy has been referenced in over 60 books, from serious historical analyses to popular World War II narratives to novels that use the massacre as plot points. At least 10 documentary films have examined the incident from various angles: survivor testimony, perpetrator motives, trial controversies. The massacre appears in video games set during the Battle of the Bulge, in museum exhibitions about the Ardennes campaign, in high school history classes discussing war crimes. This cultural persistence suggests the story resonates beyond its immediate historical significance, touching broader questions about justice, revenge, and moral clarity in war. The question of reconciliation remains unresolved. Unlike some Second World War atrocities where perpetrators and victims eventually achieved some form of mutual understanding, Malmedy never produced reconciliation. The German defendants never acknowledged genuine guilt. The American survivors never forgave. The gap between these positions never closed. Peiper died unrepentant. The last American survivor died still angry that justice was never fully served. This absence of reconciliation is itself meaningful. It suggests that some crimes are irredeemable, that some wounds don't heal, that forgiveness is not always possible or even desirable. The physical memorial at Baugnez serves multiple functions beyond commemoration. It's a teaching site where Belgian students learn about their country's experience in the Second World War. It's a pilgrimage destination for American veterans and their families connecting with history. It's a tourist attraction for World War II enthusiasts visiting European battlefields. And it's a prompt for moral reflection. Visitors reading the 84 names are confronted with the reality that these were individual human beings, each with families and futures, all murdered in 12 minutes. The memorial's power comes from this specificity, from the transformation of abstract war crimes into concrete human loss. The debate about how to remember Malmedy reflects broader tensions about historical memory. Should the focus be on German criminality, the SS troops who committed murder, or American failure, the intelligence breakdown that left soldiers vulnerable, the investigation that used torture, or Belgians suffering the civilians killed in other massacres committed by the same unit, or legal complexity, the command responsibility doctrine, the torture allegations, the commuted sentences? Each perspective emphasizes different aspects of the story, and each has validity. The absence of a single authoritative narrative is frustrating but perhaps necessary. Complex events resist simple interpretation. The question of what lessons should be drawn from Malmedy produces varied answers. Military historians emphasize tactical and strategic lessons, the importance of intelligence, the risks of overextension, the value of maintaining discipline under pressure. Legal scholars focus on command responsibility doctrine and the dangers of torture-tainted investigations. Ethicists examine how ordinary soldiers commit atrocities, how command climate shapes behavior, how institutional evil requires both systematic enablers and individual participants. Each discipline extracts different lessons, suggesting the story's richness allows multiple, valid interpretations. The survivors' testimonies, preserved through oral history projects and documentary interviews, provide the most powerful connection to the event. Hearing Homer Ford describe lying motionless while Germans walked among bodies shooting survivors is viscerally different from reading about it. Watching Virgil Larry point to photographs of the frozen field, explaining where he fell and how he survived, creates emotional connection that historical analysis cannot. These testimonies serve crucial functions. They humanize statistics, they provide witness to atrocity, they ensure that the victims aren't just names on a memorial but real people whose loss matters. With the last survivor now dead, these recorded testimonies become the closest connection remaining to the living memory of December 17th, 1944. The comparative analysis with other war crimes trials reveals Malmedy's place in the evolution of international justice. The Malmedy trial occurred simultaneously with the major Nuremberg trials, contributing to the development of war crimes law. The command responsibility doctrine established at Malmedy was later applied at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court. The torture allegations and their impact on conviction legitimacy provided cautionary precedents for human rights law. The commutation of sentences based on procedural failures established principles about investigation integrity. In this sense, Malmedy's legal legacy extends far beyond the specific case, shaping how international law approaches war crimes, prosecutions. The question of whether justice was achieved admits no simple answer. The massacre was proven beyond doubt. Perpetrators were identified, tried, and convicted. But the investigation methods were corrupt. The sentences were commuted. No one was executed. The perpetrators served an average of 10 years, less than 2 months per victim. Is this justice? By some measures, yes. Accountability was established. Legal precedents were set. History was documented. By other measures, no, the punishments were inadequate. The investigation was compromised. The victims' families were betrayed. Both assessments are valid. Justice is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. And Malmedy falls somewhere in the middle, better than no accountability, worse than full accountability. The enduring significance of Malmedy lies not in any single lesson, but in the questions it continues to raise. Can there be justice for war crimes when the victors also commit violations? What does it mean to prosecute atrocities using methods that themselves violate international law? How should societies balance the desire for accountability with the recognition that war creates impossible moral choices? Is reconciliation possible when perpetrators refuse remorse and victims refuse forgiveness? These questions lack definitive answers. But asking them, wrestling with them, refusing to accept simple narratives, this is perhaps the most important legacy of Malmedy. The massacre reminds us that war crime is not an aberration committed only by uniquely evil people, but a persistent feature of armed conflict that emerges when ordinary moral constraints collapse. Understanding this doesn't excuse the crime. It does suggest that preventing future Malmedys requires more than prosecuting perpetrators. It requires examining the systemic factors: ideology, command, climate, tactical pressure, dehumanization that make ordinary people capable of extraordinary evil. December 17th, 2024, 4 p.m., Baugnez. The commemoration concludes as winter darkness falls across the field. The visitors place wreaths at the memorial, read the names aloud, stand in silence. Snow begins falling, covering the ground as it did 80 years ago. The field looks peaceful now, pastoral, showing no trace of what happened here. But the memory remains preserved in testimony and trials, in photographs and documents, in the memorial's cold stone. 84 Americans died in this place. Their story, tragic, complex, unresolved, continues to echo across decades, asking each generation what justice means and whether we can achieve it, while maintaining the principles that make us worth defending. The questions remain, the answers remain elusive, but the memory endures, testament to what happened when the rules of war collapsed, when systematic evil met individual cruelty, when 12 minutes of violence created a legacy that 8 decades cannot erase.